order. Kate Osamore to move the motion.
Yeah. I beg to move that this House has considered the Wendy Williams Windrush Lessons Learned Review progress update. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairpersonship, Miss McVeigh, for the first time, and I will endeavour to keep my comments as brief as possible, but you know it's a bit difficult with MPs. But colleagues, today I want to talk about the Wendy Williams progress update following her Lessons Learnt review, which was published in 2020. It is more than 5 years since I began getting a steady stream of constituents approaching me who realised that they, or somebody in their family, had been victims of the Windrush scandal. Some were from families that had been torn apart with a father or mother wrongly deported. Others had been falsely imprisoned, lost their jobs, homes, been denied medical care and access to benefits. All have suffered at the hands of a government that dehumanised them as it tried to implement the hostile environment policy at all costs. They were British citizens who had been asked to jump impossible hurdles to prove their status, and having failed to do so, had endured incredible cruelty at the hands of the Home Office. 5 years later, the media, some politicians, the government have largely moved on, but many of the victims have been unable to, with only a small minority having received a personal apology from the Home Office or any compensation. Most of those affected by this terrible scandal are still waiting for any kind of justice. For most victims, the compensation scheme is the most visible response to this scandal and their path towards a resolution. However, rather than delivering justice for victims, the scheme has been so mismanaged that it has become an extension of the scandal itself. In her 2020 progress report, Wendy Williams states that her recommendations boiled down to 3 factors: that the Home Office should open up to greater external scrutiny, they should recognise that migration policy is about people, and it should be rooted in humanity. But it's clear the compensation scheme has failed to meet those challenges, being described in the progress report by claimants as traumatic, chaotic, very stressful, and a game of back and forth. The most notable failure of the compensation scheme has been the painfully slowly way it has progressed cases. So slow, in fact, that at least 28 people have now tragically died without ever having received any offer of compensation. At least 28 victims who will never, ever get justice they deserve. For most, the process has been slow, lengthy, and painful. Often they are given few updates and have little to no understanding of how their claims are progressing. Incredibly, only 1 in 4 applicants have received any compensation, and fewer than 7% of the 15,000 compensation claims the government originally expected have received a payment. For one of my constituents, waiting for an offer of compensation took more than 2 years, and in that time he was forced into more and more debt. When his son died tragically, he passed away in his sleep. While he was still awaiting a decision, he was unable to even bury his son. His experience is not unique. In her progress report, Wendy Williams highlights the timeliness of compensation payments as being one of the main concerns raised by those she consulted. The Home Office must listen to Wendy Williams and listen to the victims of this scandal. I would therefore urge the Minister to act now to speed up this process.
Yes, of course. I want to say thank you to my honourable friends for putting forward this really important debate. And I also want to say I echo the points that you've raised where Wendy Williams has talked about the fact that the process is really slow. Other things that have been raised to me is about the fact that there are poorly trained advisors, which is also causing an issue in terms of how the scheme is taking place. As well as it being slow, the scheme lacks independence. And also one of the things is that it's obviously not paying costs quickly. In other words, I just want to say to my honourable friend, does she agree with me that this is further evidence of a broken system in front of those who are dying without redress? And that the fact that the government really needs to take this seriously and implement the recommendations from Wendy Williams. Not only has she done this report in terms of lessons learned, she's also did a progress report earlier this year, and the government is still failing to implement those recommendations. We don't have the time. People need the support right now. Thank you.
I thank my honourable friend for making a very powerful intervention, and I wholeheartedly agree with what you have said. And I therefore urge the Minister to act now to speed up this process wherever possible by increasing staff numbers and simplifying the decision-making process. The victims of this scandal have been trapped in limbo for long enough. It's time to give them a resolution they are entitled to. But often, the scheme fails even the lucky few who have received an offer of compensation. The headline figures of compensation may seem like sizable amounts, but they do not reflect the life-changing trauma that so many experienced. Wrongful imprisonment can lead to an award of just £300 per day of detainment. The headline figure for deportation is £10,000, but for administrative removal, that amount drops to £5,000. Claimants who have lost out on potentially years of child benefit or working tax credits are only given just over £1,000, far less than the money or the amount they were wrongly denied. If claimants have been denied access to housing, they are given £1,000. Denial of education results in a one-off award of £500. I know of at least one instance where the total compensation offered to my constituent was less than the total debt they had been forced into as a result of the scandal. How can that be right? Give way.
I thank her for making such a powerful speech on this issue. She may recall a Guardian article last week which featured this issue of the compensation, and it featured my constituent, Cuthbert Prospero, who has lost out on years of working, years of earning, because he's still waiting for the compensation. Does she agree that many more people continue to be failed on a daily basis and are not able to live their lives because of this issue?
I thank my honourable friend for making that very powerful intervention, and I will, in my speech, actually pick up on that. And I need to put across to the Minister that it's crucial that the guidance issued to caseworkers on the levels of awards is reviewed by the Home Office urgently. They must reflect the life-changing trauma inflicted on victims of this scandal. Those who are not happy with their compensation offer are faced with a so-called appeals process that is neither truly independent nor transparent. Claimants can request a review of a decision by the adjudication officer, but ultimately the Home Office has the right to refuse the decision reached by the adjudicator. So the department marks their own homework. And although the number of claimants who request reviews is published, we have no idea how many appeal results in itself have increased or reduced the offers of the compensation. There is no external scrutiny on a process that we might, or hopefully, be able to achieve some justice for the Windrush generation. I would therefore urge the Minister to make public the outcome of the compensation appeals process, publish appeal outcomes and work to make the process as independent of the Home Office as possible. Given these concerns, it's clear the Windrush compensation is anything but rooted in humanity. In her progress report, Wendy Williams points to a lack of empathy on the part of the decision makers, and that caseworkers often fail to signpost vulnerable claimants to services that can offer non-monetary support. The claims are so complex as the humans who make them and must be treated as such. My constituent, Joel, who submitted a claim on behalf of his 89-year-old grandmother, spent 14 months going back and forth with the compensation scheme, repeatedly providing information and evidence that was requested time and time again, until suddenly, for no apparent reason, his caseworker stopped communicating with him altogether. He feared at that time his grandmother would die without seeing a penny of compensation. My constituent's grandmother, who lives in Jamaica, has now received notice that she has been deemed not in a position to be offered any compensation. Joel is an articulate lawyer, familiar with navigating bureaucracy, yet even he was unable to navigate the compensation scheme without my intervention. It's clear that the culture change called for in the Lessons Learnt review has not taken place. In concluding, all these failings amount to a second trauma for the victims of the Windrush scandal. They continue to be treated inhumanely, being forced to navigate a compensation scheme not fit for purpose. The scheme has been too slow, doesn't provide a transparent and independent appeals process. Give way, please.
My friend for giving way, she's making a very powerful case in relation to the way the scheme is being mishandled and in relation to compensation, but I wonder if she'd forgive me if I asked her about a policy issue arising from the Williams review, because she mentioned Williams' statement that migration policy should be about people. One of the issues in the discussion was about the treatment of those who came to the UK as small children, or even born here without citizenship, who grew up here, were schooled here, were shaped here, but then deported as adults. Now, in his review of immigration detention conducted for the Home Office, Stephen Shaw recommended that the Home Office should no longer seek to remove those who were born in the UK or have been brought up here from an early age. And there are countless examples of which you'll be aware. Now, I tabled an amendment to the Nationality and Borders Bill to prevent those who arrived here before they reached the age of criminal responsibility from being deported. Now, obviously, the government rejected it. But I wonder if she would agree that the UK has a responsibility to those who have never, in practical terms, known another country, or for whom we have been home since before they reached the age of criminal liability.
Well, my honourable friend will not be surprised that I agree wholeheartedly with everything you've just said. I think the Wendy Williams report has highlighted the fact that the Home Office's policies are not rooted in humanity. They do not reflect a caring society. They do not reflect a society which shows that people who have lived here all their lives are no longer welcomed by a click of a finger. We need to change that. And I think we are now in a position, and the Home Office is actually in a position to make a difference, to actually make a change, to help those people who need help now. There are so many people that are watching this. There are so many people who are stuck in the Caribbean, in West Africa, who cannot get back into this country because they are not deemed British, even though they have lived here all their lives. And in many instances, they actually have passports but cannot get into the country. So I think we need to look at this wholeheartedly. Windrush scandal, the Windrush generation is one part of it, but the hostile environment is overarching and it's overbearing, and it is dictating the way that the Home Office is responding to people who are, let's be honest, very, very vulnerable and need our support right now. They cannot wait. They've waited long enough. But unfortunately, we are where we are, and that's why this debate today is really, really important. Claimants must be offered a complete package, not only of guidance and advice, but we need the department to also reach out to these victims who have not come forward. But I'm not surprised they've not come forward if they've seen how others who have come forward have been treated. The government must look at the damage that it has made. It needs to fix this compensation scheme or hand it to somebody or to an organisation that can deliver it and actually give justice to those people that need it. The Windrush generation need us to step in for them now. The Windrush generation need us to make sure all of the damage and everything that they have been through is righted. And at this point in time, it has not. And it's an injustice. And we must look at everybody as a victim and make a difference for them. So thank you.
The question is that this House has considered Wendy Williamson's Windrush Lessons Learned Review Progress Update. We'll come to the front bench no later than 3:30. It doesn't look as if I'll need to do limitations on speeches just yet. And don't forget, the Minister needs to give some time for Kate Osamor to wind up. So if we could start the speeches with Marcia de Cordova.
Thank you, Chair. And can I firstly begin by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Edmonton, for securing this important and, can I say, timely debate today. Just last week, we were celebrating the Windrush Day, 74 years since the Empire Windrush arrived into Tilbury Docks, and I had the wonderful opportunity of celebrating with my constituents at the Ballymantooting Sports and Community Club with many of those from the Windrush generation. But, you know, when they first arrived here, they were invited to this country, including my own grandparents who travelled from Jamaica to help rebuild this country after the Second World War, but also to help, you know, work in the newly formed National Health Service. So this Windrush generation, they were British citizens when they arrived here. And their contributions to rebuilding our country and its infrastructure has been invaluable. And that is why it is such a stain on this country of how successive governments have treated them, not least with the Windrush scandal, which we are here to discuss, because as a result of that scandal, there was the review by Wendy Williams, and there was obviously lessons learned reviews that have followed that. But they have been treated and continue to be treated, not in comparison with the many sacrifices that they actually gave and made in helping rebuild our country. They've experienced racism and discrimination when they arrived here, which unfortunately, due to this scandal, does remain today. And what we saw over the past 12 years were those policies, those hostile environment policies that were introduced as parts of the Immigration Acts of 2014 and 16. And we know that many of those policies meant any support you could get or your status and access to public services relied on you proving your status. And this subsequently led to thousands of people from that generation, the Windrush generation, being denied access to public services. And this stretched from housing, so many ending up homeless, access to social security, so many ending up in destitution, but more sadly, those who were unable to prove their status, it led to devastating consequences. And many have spent their entire lives here in this country working, paying their taxes and making a valuable contribution. But those who were unable to actually prove their status did end up homeless. Many were deported back to countries that they haven't been back to for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And in some cases, as we have heard already, many ended up dying as a result of this scandal. So, Ms McVeigh, it is important to recognise the role that institutional and structural racism has played in this scandal. It's vital, as I believe it only happened because many of these people were black and brown, and it's also the countries that they had come from. And, you know, no one can deny and dismiss that fact. I think it's proven. And the government chose not to recognise this scandal, really, until it became unavoidable, because it didn't just happen overnight. You were warned about this, government were warned about this many years ago, but it took campaigning, it took pressure from the victims of the scandal, campaigners, MPs, including my right honourable friend, the member for Edmonton and Tottenham, and many, she's not quite right honourable, she's soon to be right honourable member. But many activists who really were campaigning for justice. And I remember when I came to this place in 2017, and within a year of that, the scandal really did hit, and I had to, you know, stand up in the chamber and make so many representations for my constituents that were caught up in this scandal, and genuinely could not believe what was happening. But despite the impact of those cruel and inhumane policies, I don't think the government really has learnt the lessons of that scandal, as if it did, they really wouldn't have passed that inhumane Nationality and Borders Act. You know, so what have they actually learned? And we wouldn't also have seen so many people waiting for compensation from the actual scheme itself. We know that many people haven't received compensation. We know that when they do, the compensation is so small, it really doesn't amount or compensate for what they've actually endured. And we also know that many have also lost their lives before even receiving that compensation. So I believe the government must move this scheme out. Yes.
Grateful to my honourable friend. Does my honourable friend support the idea that one of the worst things about the Windrush scandal was that this was a very proud generation. And this is a generation who thought they were British because they had travelled here on passports which were the United Kingdom and the colonies. And we're here talking about cash. We're here talking about compensation. But actually, it's the emotional impact on that generation which is the worst thing of all.
Thank you, and I couldn't say it any better. My right honourable friend has absolutely hit the nail on the head. They were British citizens when they came to this country. In fact, they called it the mother country. That's what my grandparents called it. So, you know, that's how they saw it. They were British citizens, and then so that they were treated in such a way, it really isn't right. So that is why I strongly believe that the whole compensation scheme should be moved outside of the Home Office. It should be an independent, fair, compassionate and accessible compensation scheme that doesn't have the Home Office hands over it. Wendy Williams' progress report highlights that many of those 30 recommendations haven't been met. My question to the Minister is why? I am really concerned that the recommendations to have a full review of the hostile environment policy, which has now been called the compliant environment, which we all know is still hostile, has not been achieved. She called on the Home Secretary to commission officials to undertake a review of the full review designed in partnership with external experts, evaluation of the hostile policies and measures individually and cumulatively. I don't believe no work has been progressed on that. So given the significant role that the hostile environment has played in causing the Windrush scandal in terms of its policy, I would have expected the Home Office to have prioritised completing a full review in the last 18 months. So when the Minister does respond, I would like him to answer why it hasn't yet completed a full review in partnership with those external experts. And, you know, when does his department intend to do so? Now, we have stated in the progress results, the results of the review of the policies remain an essential element in its department's efforts to demonstrate its learning, but legislation that has been produced shows that it really hasn't done so. And, you know, for us, and I'm sure for all of my colleagues, it really is about righting those wrongs. It really is about bringing justice for those people that have been caught up in this scandal, but also it's about ensuring that this scandal never, ever happens again. And I come back to the point of thinking, what have they learned? Because then they introduced the Rwanda policy. So I genuinely baffled as to when will this government and this Home Office department finally begin to learn that their policies have consequences. And if they did, you know, some simple things like carrying out impact assessments, just maybe it would highlight some of the problems with their policies that are being hostilely implemented and having a hostile impact on our communities. Thank you.
Diane Abbott.
Thank you very much. As I said earlier, my parents were the Windrush generation. They came here in the 1950s, and I remember how proud they were and how they believed they were citizens of the United Kingdom. And the whole Windrush scandal has been so painful and humiliating for them. And what has made the pain and the humiliation worse is the very slow progress in handing out compensation. Only 1 in 4 of the applicants have got their compensation. And you have to wonder if the Home Office isn't waiting for some of them to die to rid itself of the obligation to pay this compensation. Well, as the Minister will be aware, the Home Affairs Select Committee visited Sheffield, where the casework for all of this is done. And the Minister will be aware that the Home Affairs Select Committee did a report into this, and we made a number of specific recommendations. One of the most important ones is that the whole Windrush compensation operation should be handed to an independent organisation. Because one of the startling facts is the numbers of people that have actually applied for compensation is much lower than was expected. And this is because, think about it, put yourself in the shoes of those people. They do not want to go to the Home Office for anything. Whereas if it was an independent organisation, I believe that many more of the people who are entitled to compensation would come forward. And if it was an independent organisation, I believe it would be speedier and more effective in processing these claims. Now, the Home Office has rejected this suggestion out of hand, but I am bringing it forward once again. The delays, the incoherence, and also the unwillingness of possible claimants to come forward all point to the need for moving this work to an independent organisation. The other recommendation that we made, which the Home Office rejected, was to reimburse claimants for their legal costs. Now, when you put that to Home Office, they say, oh, well, it's all been devised that people don't need a lawyer. We need to tell that to the claimants. Many of them, you have to remember the generation, you have to remember that they're not necessarily used to doing things online. Many of them find that they have to use lawyers. And some of these lawyers are charging extortionate costs, 1/3 of the compensation they may get. Some of them are even charging 1/2 of the compensation they may get. It cannot be fair to offer compensation, yet allow the victims to be gouged by lawyers. And my committee has said, and I repeat it, that the government should reimburse claimants for the legal costs. The other issue that we have raised is how opaque some of the criteria are for the amount of compensation that claimants get. And we want to see more clarity around that. So my select committee went to Sheffield to see the unit that's dealing with this. And they were very nice people, but one of the things that concerned us is what they told us about the backlog. There are tens of thousands of cases, tens of thousands of claimants that the Home Office has who are in a queue. They're in a queue, and they haven't been allocated to case workers yet. And it seems to me, well, that the Minister is looking startled. He needs to go to Sheffield and ask them for himself. There are tens of thousands of cases that have not been allocated to a caseworker, and nobody in Sheffield could tell me when they were going to be allocated to a caseworker. They are dealing with more recent cases, but they have a big queue. I'd also make the point that the caseworkers were very nice. We met the caseworkers, we met their managers, we met all of those people, but not one of them was from the background that the majority of the claimants were from. And it's, yeah.
Thank you. And she's making an excellent speech, and I thank her for it. But it really does hark back to the issue of representation and leadership. Because if you're going to, it's a compensation scheme meant to be, so therefore you need people that are compassionate and also can empathise. So does she agree with that it is vital that those that are actually administering a scheme really should maybe try to be reflective of those that have been impacted by it?
I do agree with my colleague, and it is very regrettable that none of the caseworkers, none of the managers, none of the advisors actually reflect the diversity of the claimants to the Windrush scheme. And if it seems to me that if the Home Office was serious about running this scheme efficiently, they would have made more effort to make sure that the officials dealing with Windrush compensation actually reflected the communities where most of the Windrush claimants come from. So you cannot overstate the sadness and the disappointment of claimants who find themselves caught up in a labyrinth and waiting, sometimes waiting years, to understand what has happened to their claim. It is all very well and very desirable that we had a Windrush monument unveiled last week. But nobody will take this government seriously about its concern about Windrush until they make this compensation scheme much more speedy, much more efficient, and much more likely to reach those claimants before some of them pass away.
El Ribeiro Addy.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to start by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Edmonton, for securing this very vital debate. The Windrush generation have given the UK so much, because when the Windrush generation docked in Tilbury, they didn't just bring extra hands to rebuild this country. They brought dance, art, writing, cuisine and music, which transformed British culture overall. Areas across the UK like Brixton, which partly falls in my constituency, were completely reshaped by the Windrush generation, becoming central hubs of British culture as a result. And for the past 5 years, we've had the opportunity to celebrate Windrush Day and recognise and celebrate the contributions of that community up and down the country. And so next year, when we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the docking of the Empire Windrush, I sincerely hope that the government will plan nationwide celebrations that are suitable for the commemoration of the day, of a day of such national significance. I also sincerely hope that these celebrations will be a vast improvement on the £1 million practice in gesture politics that was unveiled at Waterloo Station this year. Because whilst I commend the artistry of Basil Watson, it would have been nice if the government had properly consulted the Windrush campaigners and organisations on it, including the Windrush Foundation, to discuss actually its design and its location, something that the government did not do. And if the government truly intend to honour the Windrush generation, they would take meaningful steps to fix the Windrush compensation scheme. The government itself estimated that there are up to 15,000 eligible Windrush compensation claimants. But more than 3 years after the scheme has been launched, just 26% of this number have applied and only 11% have received compensation, and at least 23 people have died waiting. The compensation scheme is a scandal in itself, as my honourable friend has outlined. Now, the government's failure to deliver compensation to victims of the Windrush scandal shows it was a mistake to entrust the scheme to the department that administered the Windrush generation suffering in the first place. So the Windrush Monument is a nice gesture, but an even nicer one would be justice. Take the scheme out of the Home Office hands and transfer it to an independent organisation that will properly deliver the compensation that these people deserve. Now, it adds insult to injury when the government continues to deny the existence of institutional racism, which members of the Windrush generation and their descendants continue to experience. And if the government really wants to honour the Windrush generation, it ought to complement that, starting with just immigration policies. Instead, they choose to push on with their hostile environment and the passing of the shameful Nationality and Borders Bill, as if they've learned nothing from the Windrush scandal. A leaked Home Office report concluded recently that the deep-rooted racism of the Windrush scandal lays in the fact that during the period between 1950 and 1981, every single piece of immigration or citizenship legislation was designed, at least in part, to reduce the number of people with black or brown skin who were permitted to live and work in the UK. That was an assessment of immigration policy from 50 years ago, but it feels like a similar assessment could be made of immigration policies today.
Wendy Williams' review boils down 30 recommendations in her Windrush Lessons Learned review to 3 main factors, one of which is that the Home Office must recognise that migration and wider Home Office policy is about people, and whatever is objective should be rooted in humanity. So I ask, as my honourable friends have asked, what part of the Rwanda policy would the Minister say is rooted in humanity? What part of splitting up families would the Minister say is rooted in humanity? What part of what's happening with the deportation flight that's recently been announced to Nigeria in Ghana, in terms of during Pride Month, attempting to deport LGBT asylum seekers is rooted in humanity? Attempting to deport mothers and grandmothers of people that are British citizens and who have been in this country for over 25 years, what part of that is rooted in humanity? And it's only recently that the government have changed its rules on citizenship fees for children that have been born in this country or lived here their entire life, from reducing it for those who cannot afford it. But what part of that was rooted in humanity? Making people who were born here not have access to the rights that they deserved as children in this country. Now, it seems that rather than enacting genuine change to apologise and atone for the Windrush scandal, the Home Office would rather gesture towards change and continue on with the culture and the practices that lead it. If the Home Office was serious about their commitment to change, they would enact the recommendations in full from the Lessons Learned review. They would invite Wendy Williams back in another 18 months' time, once again to reassess their progress against these recommendations, and they would do more to implement change. One of the very, very clear ones, which one of my honourable friends has already mentioned, is not deporting people that came here since a very young age. The government repeatedly do that. They even want to do it to people that have been born here just because they don't have a certain type of immigration status at the time. They may have been accused of some crime. When people have been here since a young age, no matter what offence they may have been committed, the reality is they're a product of British society. Where on earth are we sending them to if they have already paid their dues in prisons and whatnot? And I'll put this to the Minister as well. There are some people amongst us, and I will name the Prime Minister again, who weren't born in this country. The Prime Minister himself has committed an offence, I would say. Should he be deported because he was somebody who had to register for citizenship here? The government has at times stated that it would want to do that. See anyone that has committed some sort of offence removed from this country at some point in time. And I think that's absolutely disgraceful. The government have to implement the Wendy Williams review in full if they want to really move past the Windrush scandal. Thank you.
Paulette Hamilton.
Thank you, Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under you. I would also like to thank and congratulate the member for Edmonton for securing this very important debate and actually for making such powerful points. I feel that the points that have been made this afternoon have been absolutely brilliant. Last Wednesday marked the 74th anniversary of the Windrush migration, the journey that started with a call for help to rebuild Britain following the devastation caused by the Second World War. To mark the anniversary, I attended the launch of an amazing new exhibition called Home from Home at Back to Backs in the city of Birmingham. The exhibition creates a Caribbean household from the 1970s in Handsworth, which is where I grew up. So it was very personal to me, and the experience brought back so many memories of what our front rooms and our homes used to look like when I grew up as a child. And I'll highlight something like the Blue Spot Gram, and you know, if people get an opportunity, the cocktail cabinet, they were all there, and it really brought back some lovely memories. The exhibition. Say yes, please.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. Does my honourable friend agree with me that in that Windrush generation, there were very many black women who came to work as nurses? My mother was one. And does my honourable friend agree with me that without those nurses from the Caribbean, we wouldn't have the NHS we have today?
My honourable friend, I absolutely agree with you. And as my background is health, can I also say to you, I wouldn't have gone into nursing if it wasn't for my parents and for other people from the Caribbean, from Caribbean heritage, who absolutely were so proud to be British. They're not immigrants, they're not migrants. They came here on a British passport. They were British. The exhibition is a collaboration between a gentleman called Michael Wassifer from the Heritage Foundation and the Black Story Partnership and the National Trust. And you know what I enjoyed about it? It was great to see a major organisation such as the National Trust back this project, and it recognised the importance of black people in British history. And I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who was actually involved. But at the launch, I also heard distressing stories about the treatment of British Windrush citizens, some who were actually at the event. The Windrush scandal that we know of today began to surface in 2017 after it emerged that hundreds of Commonwealth citizens had been wrongly detained and then deported and denied their legal rights. In April 2018, the government was forced to apologise for the trauma they caused to so many people who made Britain their home for decades. To fix the wrongs, the Home Office, in my opinion, quite rightly introduced the Windrush compensation scheme. But to then add insult to injury, what then happened, the scheme was, to be honest, it's been a failure. Yep. It is complex to navigate. There's a lack of free legal advice. Claims take months to process, and compensation offers are insultingly small. And the vast majority of people who applied for compensation through the Home Office, to our disgrace, has yet to receive a penny. And sadly, we know it's too late, as was highlighted earlier, for those who have passed away before they could secure justice. And many people in this room have been to funerals where people have had to do GoFundMe because they couldn't afford to bury themselves because of what they'd been through. The Windrush generation have been failed by a deeply flawed and discriminatory immigration system created by an hostile environment where once immigrants were welcome to work and to live, today Britain's hostile environment has created a culture of fear and suspicion. The policies were introduced in 2012 by then the Home Secretary Theresa May, with the aim of making life unbearably difficult in Britain for those who cannot show the right paperwork. I want to say at this point that 3 months ago, I was so proud to have been elected as the first ever Black Member of Parliament in Birmingham. And as a child of the Windrush generation, it is painful to hear the harrowing experiences of people who still cannot get the respect and dignity they are entitled to. One constituent actually told me that they have struggled to make a successful claim under the Windrush compensation scheme. The burden of proof needed when you are unable to get access to employment makes it very difficult for those affected. The journey for many migrants started in 1948, but in 2022, over 74 years later, they are still fighting to be treated with the dignity they respect. I would urge the Minister to take these concerns on board and all the others that you've heard this afternoon and address the important issues that he has heard today. I'm just finishing. The Windrush generation built the foundations of a Britain we enjoy today. The least we can do is give them the justice they deserve. Thank you, Chair.
Jill Furness.
Thank you very much, Ms McVeigh. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairpersonship as usual. I want to commend my honourable friend, the member for Edmonton, for securing this incredibly important debate today, and the powerfulness and the eloquence that she brought to her opening comments, I think, said everything about this, as well as my other honourable friends as well, who have really put things into perspective. The Windrush scandal will forever cast a dark shadow over our nation's history. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to the Windrush generation, who have worked hard and contributed so much to our society, and not least the NHS, as we've heard from personal stories today. And the way they've been treated is no less than sickening. Let's make no bones about it. The Windrush scandal was a direct consequence of this government's hostile environment policy. This approach to policy making must be scrapped, but the circumstances which allowed the Windrush scandal to happen have not been properly addressed, and I will touch more on that later. I want to talk about the experiences of some of my own constituents affected by the Windrush scandal and the hostile environment. My constituent Tanya and her family faced immense struggles with the Home Office as a result of the scandal. She, her brother and her then 12-year-old daughter all had had multiple passport applications refused. The reason, because according to the Home Office, none of them were British citizens. This was despite the fact that they were all born in Britain, they had never stepped foot outside of Britain, and they had worked and paid taxes their entire lives in Britain. Never before had their British citizenship been called into question. The distress and hurt caused by this is unimaginable. When the rest of her family, her mother could travel, her older sisters had got passports and could travel, but her and her younger brother, within that family unit, were unable to travel with them. They were unable to go and visit where mum and dad had been born when the older sisters went. They were unable to take advantage of going on any trip abroad, and you know how that makes someone feel, and the sort of not being able to understand it and not get any sense from the Home Office about it is just a terrible, terrible way for government to react to that sort of situation. Another constituent of mine came to the UK from Jamaica with his grandparents when he was 2 years old, following the death of his father. He left the country with no family members remaining there. His mother had also left the country. He built his life in the UK and he had 2 children as well. As an adult, he was convicted of a criminal offence and received a custodial sentence. Nobody is defending his actions, but he rightly paid his debt to society. But upon his release, he was told he was to be deported to Jamaica. This came as a huge shock, as he had a young family in the UK and no ties to Jamaica whatsoever. Furthermore, he feared for his safety in Jamaica after his father, who had been killed when he was only 2, was killed in a gang-related attack. He was deported to a country he had little to no memory of and with no family around him. Many years later, due to his solicitors and my own office, he was finally given permission to return to the UK and see his children again. By then, his partner had moved on to another life, and his children barely knew him. This is just unthinkable. This was done to him by this government. If you want to see the hostile environment policy in action, that is typical of that and is very descriptive. I'd just say, far from tackling these endemic problems, the Home Office is instead going forward with the same mindset that caused the Windrush scandal. It's clear that the hostile environment policy is here to stay. Wendy Williams' review makes it absolutely clear that cultural and systematic changes are needed within the Home Office. This is so important if we are to ensure that another Windrush scandal can never happen again. But time and time again, we have seen that this has not been the case. The Home Office is still being guided by its hostile environment policy, in my opinion. Steps must be taken to make Britain once again a welcoming place for migrants, refugees and their families. Change has to come from the very top. But this Home Secretary has shown a complete lack of willpower to make positive change happen. And what we have got so far is nowhere near enough. And we're asking for justice and closure for all the Windrush generation and their families who were affected with this. The government must ensure that these people get that justice, get that closure, but most of all, get the compensation that they are entitled to. Tanya, who I referred to earlier on, got her compensation just last year. 4 years, and she was just one in 4 of all of the people out there who actually received the compensation. This is not good enough. It's bad enough these people were in the situation they were, but to leave them hanging year after year after year and making unreasonable requests for information that they know, the Home Office already knows they will not have or are unlikely to have, is really cruel, and the government must step up and do the right thing.
Olivia Blake.
Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship today, and I'd like to thank also the Honourable Member for Edmonton. I think that today's debate has been very timely, and it's been a pleasure to hear all the members who have family who have been impacted by this scandal or have come from the Windrush generation. The Windrush scandal is surely one of the most sickening episodes in recent Home Office history, so it's important that we examine the progress on the Lessons Learned review very carefully. The report concludes there has been some progress in areas, for example, on training in the Equalities Act and the history of immigration legislation. However, it's horrifyingly concerning that there has been little or no progress on the future risk areas of Wendy Williams' review. The failure to appoint a migrant commissioner, lack of engagement with the publics affected by the scandal, and the absence of formal training and development programme are cause for concern. Following the revelations of the scandal, the now former Home Secretary and member for Hastings and Rye said that the department had become too concerned with policy and strategy and sometimes loses sight of the individual. Centring the voices of individuals affected by Home Office policy and ensuring the staff have a deep and continued engagement with the issues at stake is integral to building a just and humane immigration system. And I agree with the comments made by the member for Battersea about representation within the workforce and an independent process for this. It's therefore disappointing to not see any forward movement on the risk areas highlighted in the report. But I'm also concerned that the former Home Secretary's observation about the department being too concerned with policy and strategy is also the mistake that the government is continuing to repeat, whether that is from Afghan young people being sent back home in quotation marks because they were brought up here from as far back as 2003, 2004, last summer just before the crisis struck there, or if it is in the original Lessons Learned report, Williams said that the political focus of ministers on demonstrating a system of getting a grip on the immigration problem drove internal targets, priorities and behaviour in the Home Office of the immigration system. When I read that, I can't help but think that the debate we've just been having on the Nationality and Borders Bill Act even have been truly quite worrying. Recommendation 13 of the Lessons Learned review rings in my ears. It says ministers should ensure that all policies and proposals for legislation on immigration and nationality are subjected to rigorous impact assessments in line with Treasury guidelines. Officials should avoid putting forward options on the binary do this or do nothing basis, but instead should consider a range of options. The assessment must always consider whether there is a risk of an adverse impact on racial groups who are legitimately in the country. I've lost count of the number of times I've raised with the government the policy impacts, which will, for example, on legitimate asylum claims, will affect individuals, only to hear members opposite intone that it's the only way to deal with the illegal immigration problem, and that anyone who disagreed was in favour of doing nothing, while the Nationality and Borders Act was subject to an impact assessment which said explicitly that it risked indirectly disadvantaging protected groups. It was ignored by ministers. The same problems, the same ineffective decision-making happening again and again. Matters of policy and legislation do not fall within the terms of reference of either the Lessons Learned review or the report on progress. That's why it's so important that we are discussing them here today as lawmakers, because they also contribute to the picture. The political focus on a hostile environment strategy designed to discourage people from coming here was at the heart of the Windrush scandal. To avoid future scandals and make good on the apologies that have been issued, that focus, you could even call obsession, is what needs to change. And we need to see that change in actually the lived experience of the Windrush generation and the compensation scheme. So thank you, Chair.
We'll move on to the front bench now, the SNP spokesperson, Anne McLaughlin.
Thank
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairpersonship. I want to pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Edmonton and other people in here who have been so tenacious in pursuing this, and I guarantee will continue to be if this is not resolved. The key point in all of this is that after a dreadful, shameful thing happened, there was an inquiry and a report led by Wendy Williams, the recommendations of which this government accepted, but which today, some 5 years after the scandal unfolded and 2 years after accepting the recommendations, they've only implemented 8 of the 30. On promising to implement the 30 recommendations, the Home Secretary said there would be, quote, a total transformation of culture. Well, there hasn't been, but let us remind ourselves why it was so necessary to transform that culture. What had it led to? What was so scandalous about the Windrush scandal? As we've heard from others today, people's lives were turned upside down through no fault of their own. The Honourable Member for Edmonton talked about the gentleman who got further and further into debt through no fault of his own, but through the fault of the government, so much so that when his son tragically died, he could not even pay for his funeral. Think about that. How must that have made him feel? And the Honourable Member and others for Sheffield, Brightside and Hillsborough said many of these people, rightly said many of these people, had never even set foot outside of the UK. These are people we should be celebrating. As the Honourable Member for Streatham said, these are the people who transformed our culture with, for example, music and food. And on her idea that the 75th Windrush, anniversary of the Windrush celebrations should happen across these islands next year, I guarantee that Glasgow and Scotland will be up for that. And I will, as a board member for Flag Up Scotland Jamaica, make sure that it happens in Glasgow at least. The Honourable Member for Birmingham, Erdington, I was very interested to listen to some of the memories that were evoked by that festival. And I want to tell her that my Jamaican partner has amassed a very large collection of whisky. And I am trying to persuade him at the moment to get one of those cocktail cabinets. He, the Jamaican, is not up for it, but I'm just going to get one anyway. But how was this able to happen? Well, it's like the Home Secretary acknowledged when she pledged a total transformation of culture within the Home Office. The culture there is what allowed it to happen. As their own internal report, the one that they hoped to suppress but which was leaked to The Guardian, said this, and the Honourable Member for Streatham alluded to it. I'll give the full quote. This leaked report from the Home Office said every single piece of immigration or citizenship legislation between 1950 and 1981 was designed, at least in part, to reduce the number of black or brown people permitted to live and work in the UK. Just think about that for a moment. How utterly scandalous is that? As the Honourable Member for Battersea said, that case is proven, and this, quote, is the proof. And I want to say to her, the Home Secretary, that is, through the Minister, that she should not be trying to suppress this report. It's empowering and it's freeing to own up to the truth. I speak as someone who was involved in a campaign and subsequently a major theatre production called Emancipation Act, aimed at getting the people of Scotland to own up to our past connections to slavery. It worked because people like the truth, they like honesty, and it's now widely accepted in Scotland that we were just as culpable as other countries for the Caribbean slave trade, and organisations from the University of Glasgow to Glasgow City Council, many, many more besides, are saying sorry and they're making reparations. People respect that. The Home Secretary was not in her position in the years I mentioned previously. She's not personally responsible for what happened then, so why not just publish the report, admit how awful it was, and get on with making the promised reparations? Because as we've heard, there are multiple failings in following through on Wendy Williams' recommendations. The vast majority of people don't get compensation. People have died waiting for justice. People don't trust the process, and I don't blame them. They talk of being treated with scepticism by officials. And as the Home Office Affairs Select Committee reported, the burden of proof on applicants is too great. And we've heard from the Right Honourable Member for Hackney North and Stoke Newington about extortionate legal fees that people are having to pay, and about the tens of thousands of cases not yet allocated to a caseworker. And on the point about caseworkers not reflecting the Windrush communities, I get that. I didn't always get that, but I do. And if the Minister doesn't, there is a room full of experts here who can explain it to him. So, given it's too slow, given people are still being treated with scepticism, given applicants do not trust officials, also given that the Home Office is not keeping up with the rest of its work, and, for example, my constituents seeking asylum are now waiting exceptionally long times for their initial interview, will he not finally accept the recommendation of the Home Affairs Select Committee that the scheme is transferred to an independent organisation? It would resolve those issues and it would free up valuable Home Office time. I mean, the government doesn't seem to mind outsourcing all manner of other jobs to all manner of other companies. I'll mention Mears and Atos to name but two. So why can't they do the same with the Windrush compensation scheme? Nobody is looking to get rich. But I think one of the reasons is because that independent organisation might act more fairly and might offer decent compensation. And I would argue that if someone is offered less than this scandal has cost them, then surely that is theft. There's no other word for it. And the other reason they don't want an independent company is simply because stalling on this, making people jump through hoops, letting them die whilst they wait, is all part of the doubling down on the hostile environment to which they are so wedded. As the honourable members for Streatham and for Sheffield Hallam both noted, we only have to look at the Nationality and Borders Act to know that nothing has been learned. And that was a great point that the honourable member for Sheffield Hallam made about the equality impact assessments being completely ignored. We only have to think about the plan to send asylum seekers thousands of miles away to Rwanda, a country with a human rights record that means their own people flee the country and seek asylum from them with us, to know that the hostility continues. And we only need to remember that their announcement last week of the pilot scheme that will tag asylum seekers as if they were wild dogs, to know that they simply, and my conclusion is they do not care. If they did care, they wouldn't be doing those things, and they would do the very simple but effective thing and outsource this to an independent organisation that will treat people that they have traumatised, let's not forget, with care and compassion. An organisation that people will feel comfortable approaching, that will expedite the claims and ensure that the victims of the Windrush scandal are treated with respect. Like the honourable member for Battersea and the honourable member for Hackney North and Stoke Newington, my partner has family members who came here from Jamaica to rebuild this country. His father arrived from Jamaica before Windrush. Had he been caught up in this, I would be at this minister's door every single day until he got justice. Even the thought of it is distressing to me. And I cannot imagine the distress, not just of the victims of this, but their families, their friends, and the West Indian community as a whole. Again, I want to pay tribute to the honourable member for Edmonton and others in here for their tenacity, and others who are not here but have been part of this and will continue to be, and their refusal to let this government off the hook on this. And I pay tribute to all of my fellow citizens out there whose lives were turned upside down with this. I hope some are watching so they know that we will always fight for them, for everything they've been through, and the fact that they are still standing. We are proud to stand with you. Finally, Madam Chair, I have lost count of the number of debates and meetings that have been held in this place on this. Why will the Minister not just get it sorted and let us move on to other matters? More importantly, let the people caught up in this move on with their lives. Frustrating as I find it to constantly have to revisit these matters, however, if the government thinks their procrastination will lead to us eventually giving up, they are wrong. We will have as much energy as it takes, and we won't walk away from people. We will keep on fighting for what, after all, are their rights.
Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Mrs McVeigh. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I'd like to add my thanks to my honourable friend, the member for Edmonton, for securing this vitally important debate on the latest report by Wendy Williams. My honourable friend delivered a powerful and moving speech, and so did so many other honourable friends for Battersea, Hackney North, Streatham, Birmingham, Erdington, Sheffield Brightside and Sheffield Hallam. And I was moved and humbled by much of what we heard today. The personal experiences, the family connections, the profound hurt and disrespect that was shown to a generation that helped to rebuild this country after the Second World War. It's a stain on our conscience, Madam Chair. It is a stain that has not been adequately dealt with, and that should shame us all, because we all in this House should be united around the need to show that generation that did so much for us, that worked so hard, that paid their taxes and were treated so abysmally. And I do have to gently say to the Minister that given the cross-party nature of these concerns, it is quite disappointing that there's not been a single contribution from the Conservative Party from the backbenches to this debate. Madam Chair, the Wendy Williams report is a damning indictment of the culture at the Home Office. And the sad reality is that this report has been published at a time when the government, rather than learning the lessons from the Windrush scandal, is doubling down on its hostile environment policy and mindset. And perhaps worst of all, none of the government's policies in the area of immigration are actually designed to solve any of the challenges that we face. In fact, they're just for show. The Rwanda plan is not putting people off crossing the channel. We were told that the mere threat of sending asylum seekers to Rwanda would be enough, yet hundreds of people are still coming every week on small boats. And even if a flight does one day get off the ground, the numbers will be so small that the policy will not deter and will not break the business model of the people smugglers. As has been said, the Nationality and Borders Act is profoundly lacking in any basic human decency. And the government has no answer to the growing 73,000 backlog of asylum seekers waiting for more than 6 months to be granted a decision. And these examples are directly relevant to the topic of today's debate because of the message that they send to the Windrush generation. The hostile environment is alive and kicking in the Home Office. And these strong-arm approaches, of course, are all designed to create Daily Mail headlines and to keep the Prime Minister in power. In policy terms, they only make the situation worse, as these attempts to, quote-unquote, crack down on those who have sought to make a home here have caused so much unnecessary pain in so many of the areas that we have heard in the powerful contributions from my honourable friends today. And these examples are, of course, also indicative of the type of culture change that we need to see at the Home Office, as emphasised in the Williams report, which makes clear that we need to treat every individual as a human being and not just slap a number on a forehead, or worse, use them as a political football. And here, please allow me to associate myself with all of the comments that have been made about the compensation scheme. The decision to place the compensation scheme in the hands of the Home Office was a grave error. The Windrush generation has absolutely no reason to trust the Home Office, so how can anyone possibly be surprised that they are reluctant to even apply for compensation, as we've seen from the very low numbers who are applying? Responsibility for the scheme must therefore be handed to an independent organisation, and I can confirm that I will do everything that I can as the Shadow Minister for Immigration, working with my colleagues here and beyond, to push for this to happen as urgently and immediately as possible. The Williams report also makes clear that the Home Office needs to open itself up to external scrutiny. Ministers shouldn't be marking their own homework. The report also is clear on the point that culture change is simply not happening quickly enough. In her foreword, Wendy Williams says, "My hope for the future is that the department acknowledges the efforts of its staff and the achievements it has made so far, but also recognises there's still a great deal to be done." She later writes, "The failure to implement changes promptly and consistently is a common thread running through the revisit, and that there are many examples where the department has not made progress at the pace it envisaged, or in some cases at all. The lack of progress on training is also a concern because, and I quote, "alongside internal training, There is the failure to make progress on certain outward-facing activities, such as senior-level engagement with those affected and stakeholder engagement. But equally concerning is the pace of developing wider external scrutiny arrangements. Wendy Williams also makes clear that the culture at the Home Office is not conducive to positive change. The lack of progress goes to the heart of how the department operates and is indicative of an organisation which was not yet confident enough to secure an increase in the type of independent insight and scrutiny that my recommendations envisaged, she said. This is all extremely worrying, Madam Chair, and external stakeholders are not impressed either. The report says that the majority of external stakeholders who chose to take part in the revisit believe that little, if anything, has changed. This view is also held by some of the people I spoke to in my original review, who expressed scepticism about the department's progress. Wendy Williams therefore feels that the concerns voiced remain deep-rooted and will have to be addressed if the department is to truly transform the way it engages with those who were affected. Finally, the report makes clear that all these years later on, government ministers are still yet to show that they understand the true extent of the wrong and the harm which has been done to the victims of the Windrush scandal. All of this is very damning, both in terms of the specifics of Home Office incompetence and indifference and the broader issues around the hostile environment. Madam Chair, I'm deeply concerned that we are not witnessing the changes that we need to see inside the Home Office. I've long said that the Home Office is not fit for purpose under the current Home Secretary, based on their failures over crime levels, prosecution rates, the English Channel crossings, the Passport Office, and the Afghan and Ukraine migration issues. But the failures on Windrush go to the very heart of the wretched culture encouraged by consecutive Conservative Home Secretaries. So I will today put to the government the very questions that Wendy Williams puts in her report. How will the department demonstrate to the Windrush generation it has changed and can show improvements on how it carries out its duties? How will the department demonstrate a focus on outcomes rather than outputs to assure itself it's made the necessary changes? How will the department show that its culture is improving? What measures will it use to check that it's brought all staff with it? How will the department harness local initiatives and goodwill and scale them up to demonstrate to its workforce that it is a learning organisation? How will the department be more dynamic in its efforts to develop, achieve and retain a more diverse and inclusive senior leadership cadre? How will the most senior leaders convey to the whole organisation what the priority is in terms of the culture? How willing is the department to hear from a range of voices, whether supportive or opposing? And how will the department demonstrate that it is truly taking action to continuously improve in order to rectify some of the scandalous decisions and acts that have taken place? The Minister today has a prime opportunity to answer all of these questions head on. I truly hope that he will grasp that opportunity. Thank you.
Minister.
Well, thank you, Ms McVeigh. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'd like to thank the honourable member for Edmonton for securing this debate and all the honourable and right honourable members for their contributions, many informed by their own, in some cases very personal experiences and memories of the impact and the Windrush generation. I was pretty struck, she's not in a place now, but by the member for Birmingham Erdington, recalling the experience for her and his family back in the 1950s and 60s. And look, whilst I may not agree on every aspect with the honourable member for Edmonton, I know from my regular engagement with her on casework issues, she's a committed representative of her constituents and all those affected by the Windrush scandal, which Wendy Williams' report outlined was formed under successive governments and over many decades. This is not one particular period, but an accumulation of issues. I think the case that's on the front page is from 2009 for those who read the physical version of the report. Hence, this is an immensely important top subject. It's always welcome to have the chance to debate it again. First, with this debate taking place, as it does so soon after Windrush Day, I want to take the opportunity on behalf of the government to pay tribute to the Windrush generation. They're an essential part of our national story and we should recognise, cherish and celebrate the enormous contribution they and subsequent generations have made and continue to make to our country. As the member for Battersea and others outlined, Britain today would not be what it is without them. And as the Right Honourable Member for Hackney North and Stoke Newington pointed out, many viewed themselves as British, as she touched on, the mother, coming to the mother country and invited here. And shortly after, many from particularly the Caribbean had been here defending this country in its darkest hours. You should remember our democracy survives partly due to the immense contribution that many members from the Commonwealth have been volunteering to come here, no compulsion, volunteering to come thousands of miles when this country was facing its darkest hours to stand on our shores in face of a potential Nazi invasion, that they felt that this was their country. This was not a country they were sort of migrating to. This wasn't arriving in a foreign land for them. But turning to the core focus of today's debate, in September 2021, Wendy Williams and her team returned to the Home Office to assess the progress made since the publication of her original report in March 2020, and the progress update was published in March of this year. It found there are several areas where good progress has been made, and note structures have been put in place which should provide appropriate levels of oversight of the department in the future, while also commending some excellent behaviours and initiative from members of staff and teams. In her original Lessons Learned review report, Wendy Williams made 30 recommendations. Her progress update assesses 8 have been met, a further 13 partially met, with the remaining 9 not met. And I certainly today recognise there is more work to be done. But as the update report acknowledges, change on the scale required takes time. But it is also right the Home Office is held to account on recommendations where sufficient progress has not been made. And I want to be clear, our commitment remains to delivering each and every one of the recommendations. In terms of training, significant progress, which was touched on, has been made. And, for example, training has been developed covering the history of the UK's immigration and nationality system from 1960 to 2020. And this training has been delivered to policymakers and continues to be undertaken by operational staff across the department. And colleagues in the Chamber today may be aware of the recent addition we're looking to make around, for example, the experience of Chinese seamen who faced deportation shortly after World War II, following the work done by one of the members of Parliament for Liverpool in advocating that particular case. And as some people have said, it's also important senior leaders are at the forefront of the effort to drive change across the Home Office. And Abby Tierney, who's the Director General of HM Passport Office and UK Visas and Immigration, has taken on the role of Ethics Advisor to the Home Office Board, in which she'll champion ethical behaviour and systems, advise on ethical considerations and spearhead the rollout of a new ethical decision-making model, making clear that this is at the core of what we should be doing and the core of how our systems should function. It is also, as touched on, vitally important we continue engaging outwardly and openly, and not just to voices who will agree with the Home Office or would be likely to share the views or opinions of any particular party or government. Earlier today, I welcomed to the Home Office some of the groups who received funding from the Windrush Community Fund, both to thank them for their fantastic efforts in helping promote the Windrush scheme, but also to hear their views on where we can go further and what more work we can do to reach out to more people. And we're clear we work with those groups. There is no, the funding is something that provides to support their work for their community. And, we remain committed to the relationships we have formed with these hard-working grassroots and community organisations, and we are finding their insight and experience is invaluable, and we will ensure the Home Office is proactively listening and learning all the time from the experiences they bring forward and the comments they make. Now, understandably, a lot of people are focused on the Windrush compensation scheme, and some of the reasons why I meet regularly some of the members in this room to discuss individual cases. And we recognise that whilst compensation is an important part and is necessary, we do recognise that, as sometimes touched on in other debates, financial compensation is only part of this. For many people, it was about not just the monetary impact to them, but feeling their identity was taken away, and recognising that as well. But we have made significant progress in this regard, and we've now paid or offered a total of over £48 million in compensation. And we have made changes to the Windrush compensation scheme in order to ensure people receive the compensation they're entitled to and as quickly as possible, in many cases in direct response to feedback given, including by members of Parliament. And I was pleased we were able to welcome members of the Home Affairs Select Committee and other stakeholders to the Windrush Compensation Scheme office in Sheffield on the 14th of June, following the invitation I extended during a previous debate in Westminster Hall. And I would again say to members of particular interest in this area, subject to all the usual arrangements people would expect to be put in place, we are those, particularly those who represent areas where there are a number of Windrush communities, we're very happy to welcome people to meet with the team and understand the work they're doing. I understand the victim was... Certainly, go ahead.
Before he moves off the point of the compensation scheme, he'll know that at the end of January, only 960 people had, let me just get this right, yes, had applied to the scheme, which is only about 20% of those eligible. Those are the statistics that are mentioned in the Home Affairs Select Committee report that he just mentioned on the compensation scheme. So does he agree with me that putting the compensation scheme into the hands of the Home Office, the very institution that's so profoundly mistrusted by the Windrush generation, was a grave error, and the only way that this is going to get sorted is by moving it out of the Home Office and into an entirely independent organisation?
Yeah, I must say, Madam Chairman, I'm not sure where the shadow member gets his figures from. He said 960 claims made. The actual figure is 3,878, and over 1,800 were made by the 1st of January last year. So in terms of the figures about the engagement, we continue to encourage people in a moment to apply to the compensation scheme, and have visited some of the community fund groups in Birmingham, Cardiff, Edinburgh, Nottingham and London. It was evident during these visits that innovation and collaboration are helping support local communities and raise awareness of the Windrush schemes. We have also written to 6,200 individuals to encourage them to consider applying. And in January, we launched the second phase of our national communications campaign, which featured new content to address misconceptions which could prevent people from applying to the scheme. It also included campaign videos which have been played across community TV stations. With that, I'll happily give way.
Marcia de Cordova. Thank you, and I thank the Minister for giving me. I just want to take him back to the work that the Home Office is doing in delivering the scheme, and both my right honourable friend, the member for Hackney North, and myself talked about the issues around representation of those actually delivering the scheme. And I just wondered whether he is listened and heard that point, and whether he wants to really respond to that specific point about having people deliver the scheme that can be more empathetic and actually is representative of the groups that they're seeking to compensate.
Minister. Well, as members will be aware, we are recruiting additional people into the compensation scheme in the team. We're increasing the number of staff working on it. And to be clear, despite recent pressures, the area we never took people from was Windrush work. We thought it was appropriate that that was seen as a priority. We think it's important that our caseworkers can empathise with the situation of people. And it's why, for example, we have programmes of engagement. We want them to work proactively with the community groups, hear their experiences, listen, understand where people are coming from, understand the point that this isn't just about immigration status in this case. This is about actual, about people's very strong identity. They felt, and was eloquently put earlier, that they were British. So it's about making sure that that experience is there for all casework, for all caseworkers. We do recognise is important. In terms of, I must feel that we'll pick up though, one point that was made was the idea that there are tens of thousands of applications outstanding. I would just say the number of applications received so far is just under 4,000, which would make that rather difficult numerically. And there is not cases there that are folks unallocated. We understand this arose from a misunderstanding. I will happily give way in a moment. All cases are being worked on and pursued. Of course, in some cases, there will be cases where we're waiting for responses or, for example, probate to be resolved, or we can take things further. But I must say that is one thing. We'll be writing to the Chair of the Home Affairs Committee shortly to confirm that. But I'll happily give way.
Whatever the Minister has been told, the Home Affairs Select Committee obtained quite different figures when we went to Sheffield. But I will be happy to write to the Minister and set those figures out.
Well, I thank the honourable member for intervention. I must say we have had a letter from the chair of the Select Committee following the visit, and will shortly be replying, but certainly happy to reply in further detail to the points when I receive them. Now, one of the points that has been focused on is whether the Windrush Compensation Scheme should be transferred to an independent organisation. I can understand why that might sound appealing. However, one, we believe that would risk delaying payments to people even further. And secondly, in many cases, they would have to come back to Home Office records and to other parts of the Home Office, which means we would still be very, very heavily involved. Now, I don't believe for 1 minute anyone's suggesting we should contract this out, as might have been being partly suggested in terms of a private sector operator. But as we say, we believe it's better and right that we have a team that operates separately and independently to other areas of the Home Office and is able to take matters forward with clear delineations and making very clear that certain information supplied to the Windrush team is not available to wider Home Office operations, and that the focus needs to be on paying compensation and getting the scheme forward rather than who is actually administered. I'll give one way for one last time, because I'm conscious I need to allow time to wind up.
Thank you. I'll try and make the point succinctly. So I don't think anybody is asking for any scheme to be contracted out to a private company. So the point here is about it being independent of the Home Office, because the Home Office are the administrators of the policy. Therefore, how can people look? You're having to do marketing videos and everything else, and people, people still are reluctant. They are fearful due to the hostile environment. So it's about an independent. That can be an independent charitable organisation, not private companies.
Well, the point that's made, and I think we'd all agree that a private company would not be the right option for this. Setting up a different organisation would clearly take time. Again, they would be reliant on the vast majority of records and processes from the Home Office. However, what we recognise that people won't necessarily want to approach the Home Office in the first instance. It's why we work with the community groups. It's why we're having some very helpful and very productive conversations with some of the high commissions here in London about whether they could host events, particularly now we've been able to return to having drop-in events. I think we'll all realise why over the last 2 years the ability to hold drop-in events has been far more limited than we would have liked. But it's certainly one that we're clear that the way it is working, our focus really wants to be in getting on and making compensation payments. Now, one of the points that was picked up was around the issue of the Migrants Commission, and I recognise that Wendy Williams mentioned her disappointment in regards to this. What I can reassure colleagues is that a substantial amount of work has been done on options to deliver this recommendation. We're working with external stakeholders and set up a subgroup of the Windrush Cross-Government Working Group to advise on the function of a Migrants Commissioner. And they've submitted their recommendations on what the function should look like, including the scope of the role and the best model for delivering it. And we are now considering the subgroup's views. And I think to be clear for colleagues in the room, so members in the room, that is not necessarily a suggestion about being an individual, but about whether it could be a group that fulfills that role. So certainly we are keen to take it forward, but we're keen to take it forward in a way that builds confidence. Ms McVeigh, I want to thank the Honourable Member again for securing this debate and all who have contributed to it. As I've set out, we have taken some important strides forward in responding to the Wendy Williams report, but we recognise there is still a lot of work to do within the Home Office, work which is always enhanced by the constructive challenge we've received from Honourable and Right Honourable Members today. The failings of the past were unacceptable, and I know there is a real determination across the Home Office to learn the lessons of Windrush. There is a strong focus across the department on delivering the improvements set out in Wendy Williams' review, and as colleagues and the public would expect, the implementation of her recommendations is closely monitored. Concerted action is taking place to drive cultural change and to make a Home Office that is fit for the future. A department that needs to be open and outward working, that views people as faces, not cases, as an individual, not a number. Committed to making fair and just decisions and ensuring that we treat people as they have the right to be expected to be treated. The injustices of the Windrush scandal should never have happened. This is why we are wholeheartedly committed to doing all we can to right those wrongs.
Kate Ossamore to wind up.
Thank you. Ms McVeigh. I want to say thank you to everyone for your powerful contributions and for speaking up for the voiceless and supporting the Windrush generation. The government minister, will not be surprised that I am not happy with a lot of the things that he has said, based on the fact that Wendy Williams has made it very, very clear that the department has overstated progress made and closed some recommendations prematurely. So it shows that the report has not landed well. It's still not been taken seriously. The scheme is too slow. The victims are still waiting for compensation, and until we see more victims getting some compensation, the other victims who are not coming forward will start coming forward. So I think that we need to look at the department, we need to understand why it's not working. Wendy Williams has made it very clear. I ask the Minister to take this report as something which will only help the department and not hinder the department. And again, I thank everyone for your contributions today, and I want the Windrush generation to know that we will continue to speak up for them until justice is proved.
Order, order. Order. I will call Jake Berry to move the motion, and I will then call the Minister to respond. There will not be an opportunity for the member in charge to wind up, as the convention is for a 30-minute debate. Order, order. Jake Berry to move the motion.
Thank you, Mrs McVeigh. And can I say that I beg to move that this House will consider flooding in Irwell Vale and the surrounding areas. And can I also say what a pleasure it is, I think, for the first time to speak under your redoubtable chairmanship. Look, flooding is an issue that affects communities all over the United Kingdom. I know that many colleagues who've come today will live in areas that are affected by flooding, and they will understand that when communities flood, the effect is absolutely profound and devastating on them, and it's completely debilitating for these communities who moved into an area, yes, maybe with the acceptance that they had a once in every 100-year flood risk, but by gum, they've been surprised that they have been flooded 2, 3, 4 times in a decade. And in the last few years, hundreds of lives across my constituency of Rossendale and Darwen have been negatively affected. And we've had homes and businesses flooded in Whitworth, Bacup, Stacksteads, Waterfoot, Darwen, Rottenstall, Helmshaw, Irwell Vale, Strongstride and Chatterton. And these floods have absolutely devastated these communities in the last 10 years. And the reason we flood is actually one of the reasons we are one of the most picturesque and beautiful areas in the United Kingdom to live is because we have so many lovely rivers, the Limey Water, the Whitewell Brook, the Darwen, the Spodden and the Ogden and the Irwell. In the summer, they are beautiful burbling brooks, which become raging torrents in the winter months. And it's those last 2 rivers, the Ogden and the Irwell, which really affect the residents of Irwell Vale, because there is a confluence of those rivers just before you get to the village, and they've flooded Irwell Vale, Chatterton and Strongstride repeatedly, and these floods have been devastating. And that is why it's proved historically so difficult to mitigate against the flood risk, because it's a wide catchment that the water comes from. And I've visited those communities on several occasions after they have flooded, and it's just completely devastating, the impact it has on their lives. And this is something the Prime Minister has demonstrated that he understands. He recently visited Didsbury in Greater Manchester after some flooding there and said, and I quote, "There is a huge psychological, emotional and financial cost to these communities that flood." And I absolutely agree with him. And that is why I'm incredibly grateful that the Minister and her department over the last 9 years has already provided £1 million for investment in our local communities to try and stop the flooding. Back in 2014, residents of the village of Stubbins were delighted when I and others opened their long-awaited flood defences, which were finally completed. But this, it's the ongoing challenge that we have in this catchment area that makes up the River Irwell and covers other areas that I wanted to talk about today. Floods have particularly affected Irwell Vale, but they do, they do affect tens of thousands of people across this country, and that's why it's such a priority for our government. The River Irwell cuts through my constituency, and it's a river that was previously thought to flood very infrequently. In fact, it was in the 100-year risk. But that said, it has flooded in 2007, 2012, 2015, and in 2020. And the communities of Irwell Vale, Strongstride and Chatterton also have the dual risk of overland flooding as well. It's not just raised river levels, and that's because they're in a deep, sheer-sided valley that where you have heavy rainfall combined with rising river levels, it can come from the back of their house as well as the front of their houses. And only in February when I was down there, I was talking to the community, and they sort of explained how family members felt they couldn't leave home because they were constantly clicking refresh on the government's online flooding monitor, and they sort of felt that they'd be more likely to flood if they weren't in the house. And while that isn't particularly rational, it shows what a huge impact living in a floodplain in a community that floods has, on the mental health of these families. And that's why I think it's really important that we debate the impact today. For a number of years now, I've worked very closely with the Environment Agency and the government and the communities as well to try and find a solution that will serve this community, not just in the short term, but for generations to come. And the government has stated as its policy that it's not about how big a community is, and this is a small community. All communities must be supported, and that's something I hope the government will reaffirm today. Because, of course, the whole point of our levelling up agenda in government is that no community gets left behind. No matter the smallest hamlet is as important to the minister as the greatest city. But unfortunately, it is all too often the smallest hamlet that gets flooded and needs these flood defences. So I hope the Minister will decide today or reaffirm today that no community is too small to have the benefit of government flood defence spending. Just talking very directly about the Environment Agency plan for Irwell Vale, Chatterton and Strongstride. Following the 2015 flooding, the Environment Agency worked very closely, both with myself and the local community, and did a large-scale appraisal on a whole catchment basis for the River Irwell and its tributaries. And this was followed by a capital funding bid to further reappraise flooding issues and possible mitigation work for this community. Following the floods in 2020, which were particularly devastating again, the Environment Agency did further extensive work to ensure that solutions would properly deal with the increased flooding frequency. I find that extraordinary, actually. Just between 2015 and 2020, there was such a change in expectation of the flooding in this community that they really had to revisit all the work that they'd already done, and that I think tells you how our concern should be for these communities that are just going to be subject to more frequent flooding events. Yes, I'll happily give way.
Thank you very much to my right honourable friend for giving way. I want to pay tribute to him for his efforts in respect of securing funding. I know we're going to hear a little more about that in a second. I, like him, was at Irwell Vale during this period where there's been severe flooding, and it was catastrophic. It really was. It was genuinely appalling. Can I ask him, this Irwell Vale is about 1.5 miles away from my constituency. The scheme he's about to describe, he knows Ramsbottom well, which is a fine town in my constituency. How does he feel this plan will help flood defences in Ramsbottom?
Well, thank my honourable friend for that intervention. First of all, Irwell Vale is a wonderful place, as he knows, having visited it. It's actually my main dog walking route, so it's a community I like to do. And I always do the leaflets there at elections as well, but that's not relevant to today's debate. But it's part of a string of villages and towns that are along the River Irwell. The next significant town along is Ramsbottom, which is a wonderful place as well. A lot of what the Environment Agency is proposing in their current plan is about slowing the water flow down on the River Irwell. It isn't just, though it is described as a linear flood defence, which would just make colleagues think of me campaigning to swoosh it past my constituencies, sort of came over the top in Ramsbottom. That absolutely, even though that was maybe my proposal, it's not, but that absolutely isn't the proposal of the Environment Agency. And all of the mitigation measures they are taking further up the Irwell Valley will benefit Ramsbottom, which I know as a community has had significant flood events, particularly the local businesses, which I know my honourable friend works very closely with. So this isn't really, even though there are only 100 or so houses that are directly identified as benefiting from this work, it would in fact benefit the whole of the River Irwell catchment. And he will know that it's a river that also goes into the centre of Manchester and has been responsible for flooding in Salford in the past. So that's why, you know, I know the Minister will want to look at this whole catchment approach, because what you do in Irwell Vale benefits Ramsbottom and Waterside, of course. So an economic assessment has been undertaken by the Environment Agency, and the benefit and cost of all of the options has been assessed. And the most economically favourable solution, you know, frankly, that is most likely to gain the maximum amount of grant aid from the government has been identified. There was a long list of options, many of which I looked at myself. This was turned into a short list, and the preferred option has now been chosen, and the preferred option is what the Environment Agency referred to, I think slightly misleadingly, as a linear defence, but it does include several mitigation measures to slow down flow. And this brings me really to where we are today. The problem that faces the Irwell Vale residents and communities and other communities is that grant aid funding will not cover the cost of the project needed in my constituency. It's been clear for quite a while now that if this scheme is to deliver meaningful and sustainable solutions, that we're going to have to look at a cocktail of government funding to support it, unless we are going to ask communities to pay significant amounts of money themselves, which, you know, frankly, they just can't afford. So the estimated current cost of the project is £19.6 million, which I appreciate is not insignificant. And in truth, if the Minister or any of her colleagues were ever to come and visit Irwell Vale, if she engaged with or spoke to the community, as I know she would, the community understand that this is a really expensive scheme, and they've been completely sort of realistic and pragmatic about the need to work really hard themselves to support looking for funding. Of that 19 million, which sounds like a huge amount of money, we have already secured just over £11 million, and that really brings me to the rump, the £8 million that we will be looking to the government to support. The Environment Agency, supported by me and the community, has already applied to the Frequently Flooded Communities Fund and other government departments as well, and is also looking to increase the local levy contribution to try and make up some of that shortfall. But we believe that the Frequently Flooded Community Funds is absolutely central to delivering this scheme in Irwell Vale, although the Minister may have different views, and we know that the government hasn't yet made decisions in relation to the Frequently Flooded Communities Fund, and basically that's one of the reasons for this debate, is to gently nudge the department and say this would be a very good thing to do for the residents of Irwell Vale, Strongstrike and Chatterton. Last year, the government also announced another £5.2 billion would be available for flood work over the next 5 years, and that would be invested into flood alleviation schemes. I think this is a really important scheme, not just for my constituency, but for the wider River Irwell catchment. I'm excited that the government's allocated so much more funding, I think more money than any government in history. In fact, I know it's more money than any government in history to tackle flooding. And I just hope that this scheme, which is locally supported by the Environment Agency, supported by the council that I share with my honourable friend for Hyndburn, and supported by the members of Parliament, will be something they may look on favourably. I want to thank the honourable member for Hyndburn for attending today's debate.
Member Frank, give way very briefly. I think we should. My honourable friend is making an excellent speech, and he is outlining the threat that the River Irwell, pretty as it is, but the government have recognised this. In my constituency, in the Bury South constituency, £30 million of budget have been invested in Radcliffe and Red Vales because of the threat that the Irwell poses to housing in that area. So I don't think it can be understated the strong case that my honourable friend is making for investment, because the evidence clearly shows destruction will follow unless the money is invested.
I thank the honourable gentleman for that point. I mean, you know, realistically, I mean, I know those areas well. There are thousands of houses there. These beautiful villages in my constituency, there's 100 plus houses. So I understand that the government has to prioritise funding. There isn't an endless pot of money, but I would just say that we have been waiting a very long time, and we've been flooded lots of times. And I hope that, you know, now Radcliffe and other areas of Bury and Ramsbottom's had some significant flooding investments as well. I hope the Minister will understand that we rightly think that it's now our turn. And we do need to see this investment, because it's relatively few houses, but in truth, and I'll finish with this, you don't care whether there's 100 houses in your community or 1,000 houses in your community. We talk about houses. I think in politics, actually, we should really talk about homes, because people don't live in houses. We all live in our own home. And it's not just 4 walls and a roof. You'll have your photograph albums from when your children or grandchildren were at school. You'll have loved items of family furniture that may have been in your family for generations. You'll have all of your possessions in your house. And when that water comes through the air bricks on your house or up under your floorboards, you're not just damaging people's houses. In many cases, you're washing away their life. You're washing away a lifetime of memories. You're washing away all of those happy events they've had in their home. And that's why this is such an important scheme. Because if you live in Irwell Vale, Chatterton or Strongstry, you've had that happen to you 5 times in the last decade. And we don't often in politics, I think, get to point back at things and say, you know, I'm really proud that I was part of that. We probably should do a bit more of it. But if I can deliver this money for the community that I have the privilege of representing, it will give me something. It's not about me, but it will give me a real opportunity to proudly say that these debates in Parliament, this debate we're having today, transform people's lives. So I'd say to the Minister, I'd be grateful to hear from him about future funding and the government's ambition to fund this scheme. But also, I hope she will accept that I don't want to have to go back to any of these communities next winter or maybe the winter afterwards and explain to them why their life has been washed away again. But I think we have a real opportunity today to change that.
Yeah. Minister. Thank you, once again under your chairmanship, and I would like to thank the Right Honourable Gentleman very much for securing this really important debate regarding the flooding in Irwell Vale and in describing the area and its inhabitants so passionately and so well to those of us in the chamber today. It's also good to see the Honourable Lady from Hyndburn and the Honourable Gentleman from Bury North, who of course remind us by their very presence that raging torrents do not stop at constituency boundaries, and that we have to look at this problem in a whole catchment, in a catchment-sensitive way. I know that the Environment Minister is very sorry not to be here responding to this debate, but she is at the United Nations Oceans Conference in Lisbon, and I'm afraid that you have her stand-in today, but I undertake to speak to her about this and to ensure that she meets with interested colleagues once again to discuss the particular issues that have been outlined this afternoon about this scheme. The devastation caused by flooding is terrible, and I say that as somebody who's lived all my life in the Cherwell Valley. I sympathise very deeply with those affected and those who have been affected repeatedly over the last 10 years. It's even more devastating when a specific location is affected again and again, because as the Right Honourable Gentleman outlined, you very rarely, as a resident, have a moment's peace when the rain is coming, as he describes so graphically, from both directions.
I would like to pass on my sympathy to all residents in the honourable members' constituencies who have been affected by flooding, including some really dreadful events in February 2020 when 56 houses were flooded, and in Boxing Day 2015, the really bad one, when 94 properties were flooded. I'd be delighted.
Honourable friend for giving way. And one of the things that she mentions there with the 2015 flooding on Boxing Day, what that did, and my honourable friend will know, that was actually brought all of our communities together. But what it also does is take away from all of our local police services, etc., because they were coming from Blackburn, Bolton, Burnley, to tackle this on Boxing Day, where we know there's already issues in communities sometimes on Boxing Day with what we know goes on. But does she agree with me that actually this is one of the things, it's whole communities that are affected? And another thing to mention is that we want people to live in these beautiful places in our patches, but the insurance on houses now is near impossible to get because of the flooding that we see.
Minister. The Honourable Lady makes some really important points there, and it is always good to have flooding conversations and flooding debates with a group of interested colleagues. These are ones that really need to take place, and the decisions that really need to be made in a very joined up way. So Irwell Vale and the nearby areas, including Strong Street and Chatterton, face a combination of risks from river, surface water and groundwater flooding, which are all interconnected and therefore very difficult to deal with in isolation. When flooding has taken place, the water has been very deep and fast flowing and has cut off access to these communities in many cases very badly. The EA recognises the importance of trying to alleviate the flood risk as much as possible, especially given the complexity of the risks, and that's why the EA, working very closely with partners including Lancashire County Council, has installed a permanent automatic pump to help reduce the frequency of the surface water, and has done various works on banks and embankments with those communities, along with gravel removal. The Right Honourable Gentleman mentioned the Irwell Vale scheme, sometimes described as a linear scheme, but rightly he said it was much more than that. The estimated cost of this scheme is £19.5 million. The EA has secured around £11 million for this scheme through various sources such as the grant in aid, local levy, and from the assets replacement allocation. And as he said, this leaves a funding gap of £8.5 million. I would be delighted.
One of the other challenges, and I don't expect an answer today, but I would be grateful if she could write to me if she doesn't know the answer. I've been told by the EA that one of the challenges is that they can't actually start the work on any of the scheme until they can do all of the scheme. That's very frustrating for local residents to know that that 11 million is secured but not drawable till they've got the full 19. Could she undertake to go away with her officials and see whether it is possible to do some of the elements of the scheme, particularly the wall rebuilding in Irwell Vale, which would protect properties now, in the hope and belief that further assets in the scheme could be funded at a later date?
I'd be delighted to undertake to do that. I did meet with the EA team earlier today, and one of my questions was, could part of this scheme be delivered while we still continue to look and work together on further sources of income for the remaining £8.5 million. I was told it wasn't quite as easy as that, but I absolutely undertake to ask for a detailed answer for the Right Honourable Gentleman, because I think that some of the wall rebuilding perhaps might alleviate some of the concerns that residents have at the moment. The Frequent Flooded Communities Fund may not be the correct route for further applications for funding, but I was very, very firmly reassured by the EA that they are leaving no stone unturned in trying to source the remainder of this funding, and that there are several routes that are being considered at the moment. So I would encourage all interested colleagues to continue to work with the group of partners who are determined to make this happen. I took the point that the Right Honourable Gentleman made about how all communities must be protected, and the fact that there are 100 houses in
Would my honourable friend give way on that point?
Is not, I will,
of course.
1 second, is not in itself a barrier to finding substantial amount of funding. As he said, this is his dog walking route. This is a very beautiful area. There are aspects of biodiversity that need to be protected and looked after as well. So it's not just about the home. So those are, of course, the most significant factor.
James Daly.
Thank my right honourable friend for that, and as you've heard, I think this is an excellent scheme with a fantastic champion. But all communities need to be protected, and Ramsbottom within my constituency is 1.5 miles down the road from Irwell Vale. We have had £484,000 of investment in the whole of the Bury North constituency. It's not enough to protect families and businesses on Kenyon Street in Ramsbottom. So will my honourable friend agree to meet with me or somebody from the department to discuss what we can do to ensure that Ramsbottom has adequate flood defences?
I know that my honourable friend, the Environment Minister, would be delighted to meet with the honourable gentleman. And I also know that the Radcliffe and Red Vale schemes have been really useful in his constituency. And absolutely the point that the right honourable gentleman made about how this isn't a linear scheme. The aim is not to move the water from one constituency to another and cause problems there, is a valid one. And that is why it is really important that we continue to deal with these flooding issues holistically, and we look at these schemes as part of a wider picture. The right honourable gentleman mentioned the benefits of wider catchment approaches to flood management. I very much agree that a whole catchment approach can unlock opportunities for areas such as the one we're discussing this afternoon. And the government has committed to transform the current approach to local flood and coastal erosion risk planning. Every area of England will have a more strategic and comprehensive plan that drives long-term local action, and that will be in place by 2026. The EA is already implementing this approach of wider catchment benefits and taking this whole catchment approach to new funding bids, and they are collaborating with partners such as Moors for the Future and the National Trust to deliver a natural flood management suite of measures in the Upper Irwell catchment. This included moorland restoration on Holcombe Moor and slow the flow measures in Buckton Brook. And I do think that it is very important that we continue to look at the wider picture when managing this water. The Honourable Lady from Taunton Deane has asked me to reassure honourable members present that flood and coastal risk management is a top priority for the government. I would reiterate that she would be absolutely delighted to meet members from this area to discuss the specifics of the bid and the new plan and where that funding gap can be filled from. And I thank all honourable members for this very informative debate.
The question is that this House has considered flooding in Irwell Vale and surrounding areas. As many as of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order, order. Order. Owen Thompson to move the motion.
Thank you, Chair, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to secure the debate today and talk about an issue very close to my heart and that of my community, an absolutely integral part of Scotland and the UK's history and present. In advance of this debate, having been told I'd secured it, I reached out to the community in Midlothian and asked for views and memories of many of those who had been involved at the time in the height of the miners' strikes, and was overwhelmed with the response from residents in Midlothian, and very thankful to them for sharing their memories and experience. But as events fall into the past and become history, it's very easy to forget that the people involved were real people. Their lives mattered and they were affected in very tangible ways. In the case of the miners' strike of 1984-85, the history isn't that long ago, and the people at the heart of it are still feeling real pain and injustice. I have to say that's at the time I moved to Lonehead, so we kind of moved to the town at the height of the strikes. Criminal records, lost pensions, social stigma, these were the real-world consequences that many are still living with, but they've never been fully addressed or listened to. But that can change. Ex-miners and their families deserve the chance to feel listened to and for the government to take action off the back of what they say. That's why I'm calling for a public inquiry into the strikes and to get the answers and redress for those affected by the many injustices that those events caused. This isn't about a grievance, nor is it about dwelling in the past. It's about the future. It's about recognising that to move forward, we need to heal the wounds of the past. Now, how we approach the past says a lot about who we are today. Do we learn from injustice? Do we listen to lessons learned? Or will we do it all again, given the chance? These are the questions that need answered for the sake of communities across the country, especially like my own in Midlothian. The way we achieve that is through a public inquiry into the policing of the strikes. Mining Midlothian dates back all the way to the 12th century, when the monks of Newbattle Abbey first began extracting coal. By the 20th century, mining was integral to the country's way of life. Midlothian was a home of a range of pits, from Bilston Glen and Monkton Hall to the first Victorian super pit at the Lady Victoria Colliery, still the home of Scotland's Mining Museum, and I would recommend a visit to any members present. But by the 1980, mines meant miners' strikes. A token picket of 6 was maintained at Monkton Hall, but at Bilston Glen and Lonehead, it saw the mass picketing and some of the most bitter conflicts in the striking in Scotland. Such was the significance of Bilston Glen and the story of the strike that Tom Wood, the former Deputy Chief Constable of Lothian and Borders Police, said, "Did we have violent confrontations? Yes, we did. And they were mainly in the days when visiting pickets came to Bilston Glen." And according to Professor Jim Murdoch, minor stories showed without doubt that the criminal justice system all too often reacted in an arbitrary and disproportionate manner. This is unfair and unbalanced reaction from authorities, and it often took the form of arbitrary sentences being handed out, usually whether charges stuck or not. And during the recent committee stages and looking into the Scottish Government's minor strike pardons bill, a former colleague of mine in Midlothian Council, Alec Bennett, former miner at Monkton Hall, said, "I was snatched by one of the snatch squads. They went for the union officials and they knew our names. The original charges were for rioting, but that wasn't going to stick, so they changed it to breach of the peace. The tactic was to simply use whatever means necessary to get miners, especially union officials, off the picket line and into the cells. Breach of the peace, obstructing a police officer, breach of bail and theft, all of these charges and more were twisted to justify the snatch squad's style of policing. It would be better suited to Putin's Russia today. This is not what good policing looks like, and it does an injustice to the rule of law. And serious questions still remain to be answered about the extent of alleged political interference in the policing of the strike."
I thank the honourable member for giving way. He's making a very powerful speech. The events of 84 and 85 shaped many of our politics, including mine. I grew up in Castleford, West Yorkshire, a mining community. I remember some of the police tactics. people stopping us from going about our community, the Metropolitan Police in particular. Those events shape my politics, you know, obviously in my case Labour, and I thank certainly that experience, but also Margaret Thatcher, would you believe it, for my membership of the Labour Party. I commend you in terms of campaigning with others across the chamber for truth and justice for Orgreave.
Absolutely, and I thank the honourable member for his contribution. And I think, like so many, these events, and events like this, have shaped the politics of so many and brought many to a more active role in politics through whatever means, the Labour Party, SNP, whatever it was. Events like this bring people forward. And the honourable member mentions the Orgreave situation, and I had a conversation earlier with Chris Peace from the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign, and I think it's certainly worth highlighting from their side of things as well that there are still serious unanswered questions. But disproportionate response to strikes didn't stop in the courts. It affected miners' financial futures. Arrested strikers were sacked and denied redundancy payments and pension rights. Again, from the evidence that Alec Bennett gave to the Holyrood Committee, only later on did we realise that anybody who'd been arrested was not just going to get fired. They were going to lose their job and lose their redundancy payment. I was an official in the miners' union, and we used to sit in with the men when they were getting made redundant. I knew exactly what I would have got if I'd been made redundant at the time. I would have qualified for $27,000 in 1985. I never got that, and it's still bitter to this day that I was denied that because of the attitude of the Coal Board in Scotland. He was one of over 100 miners who were blacklisted, and it took many of them years to find work. And I have to say, on top of this, a former spy, Chief Dame Stella Remington, revealed that MI5 tapped union leaders' phones during the strike. This was broadcast by Channel 4 dispatches as far back as 1994. Now, Midlothian, as much in the 80s as today, is a place where community is king, and we only have to look over the last month to every weekend there was a community event or gala day, and just at the Saturday past at Lonehead Gala Day, the home of Bilston Glen, we have the Miners' Memorial, where it's now an integral part of Gala Day celebrations that we remember those who lost their lives in the pits. But I think as part of that, it's also important that we remember what else happened around the pits. Within each town and village, people know each other, and folk from all walks of life intermingle, and that's exactly what made the strikes such a bitter affair. In Dander Hall, the local miners' club had a bowling green, and the Lothian Borders Police would use for their annual competition. Police and miners would have a good bevy together afterwards and chat and chew the fat. After the strike, that connection was severed, and that's no small thing for a close-knit community like Midlothian and many others. But it's worth being clear about this. This isn't just an exercise in digging up the past. It's about recognising what wrong has been done, and that now we have the power to address it. The Scottish Government rightly recognised the scale of this injustice back in 2018, when it commissioned an independent review led by John Scott QC into the impact of policing on communities during the strike. Following testimonies from former miners, police officers and mining communities, the review group made one single recommendation, that the Scottish Government should introduce legislation to pardon miners convicted for certain matters related to the strike. The Minor Strike Pardons Bill was welcomed by the NUM for removing the stigma of a criminal record, and I'm delighted to see that bill having passed unanimously, I have to say, in the Scottish Parliament within the last couple of weeks. So some might ask why we need a UK inquiry if the Scottish one was such a success. Aside from the fact that miners and their families across the rest of the UK also deserve justice, it's important to look at what the Scottish inquiry couldn't do. It couldn't consider elements of policy reserved to the UK, including the crucial issue of trade union relations. It couldn't address the allegations of political interference by the UK government, an absolutely critical question. Without these missing pieces, ex-miners and their families will never get the full truth. Only a UK-wide inquiry can deliver that. And on top of that, we have to consider the question of compensation. It's only natural. And in many cases, a pardon simply won't be enough to undo decades of financial loss suffered by many miners. Unfair dismissal and the subsequent loss of redundancy payments and pension rights has a lasting effect impacting on many to this day. Ex-miners and their families deserve a compensation scheme to ensure not only moral justice, but an economic justice too. As such, the Scottish Government supports this idea, but its hands are tied by devolution. Employment and industrial relations are reserved to this place, so it's up to the UK Government to devise such a scheme. A compensation system that's uniform and fair across the UK is something that only a UK-wide inquiry could deliver. It's crucial that any inquiry should put reconciliation at its heart, just as the Scottish inquiry did. The principles at the heart of the review were put so eloquently by Professor Jim Murdoch, as he stated as following: "As members of the independent review, our task was primarily to listen, to show that those affected by the miners' strike had a voice more than a third of a century later. At each of the meetings we held, it was clear that the pain felt by former miners and their families was still raw. Our task was to seek to promote a sense of reconciliation." The miners' strike is a part of our history, and it's shaped communities like Midlothian to this day. My own predecessor in this place, former MP for Midlothian, Sir David Hamilton, or Davy as he's still very well known in Midlothian, was not only an ex-miner, but he was arrested on the Bilston Glen picket line and blacklisted. And as I understand, the only miner to actually face trial by jury and be acquitted through the strikes. It's hard to overstate the impact of the strike on our politics even today, to relate back to the point by the Honourable Member. But mining communities also shape our future. Midlothian's mines are now abandoned and flooded, but that very water in the mines is an energy source rich with huge potential. By tapping geothermal energy from the heat in that mine water, we could use that power for the future. I applaud local activists, academics and the Coal Authority for working to make mine water energy a reality across the country, and it's something that I continue to push for in Midlothian. And in looking ahead to that future, it's never too late to right the wrongs of the past. Sometimes time needs to pass before our society is mature enough to throw its hand up and admit that it did wrong. So it's not unusual to have historic inquiries into events long after the fact. Take example of Bloody Sunday. It took 36 years for an inquiry to be launched into those shootings, and the final report was published 15 years after that. It should happen sooner. Nobody can, I think, deny that. But likewise, we should have had an inquiry into the miners' strike years ago. But the best time to plant a tree may have been yesterday, so the second best time is now. It's never too late. All history is contested, and there are two sides to every story: miners, police, communities, government. But a government proves its maturity by being able to listen to both stories and represent them equally. By weaving the injustices of the miners' strike into our national story, we show our history is for everyone and is truly national. That process of healing, and by picking up the Scottish Government's baton and delivering, could start today. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered the potential merits of a UK-wide inquiry into the miners' strike of 1984 to 1985. I'll be calling the front bench no later than 5:10, so everybody please be mindful of allowing everybody enough time to speak. Alex Davis-Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It is an honour to serve under your chairship today. My thanks also to the Honourable Member for Rossendale and Darwin, my Vice Chair in RAPPG for Caulfield Communities, which I proudly chair, Ms McVeigh, for securing this debate, this important debate, which is close to all of our hearts, as he mentioned. My honourable friend, the member for Weaver Vale, mentioned that the 84-85 strike shaped our politics. It made me. I am who I am because of that strike. My dad was a miner who was on strike in 84-85. I've proudly spoken about how I am very proudly my father's daughter. And he instilled in me all of the beliefs that I hold very firm, dear to me today, and have put me in this place, Mr McVeigh, as has my community, of which I am very, very thankful. Yeah. And it is because of that that I stand here today, and I want to focus my comments around the shocking events of the 18th of June 1984, which are crystallised in the minds of thousands and all of our communities. Scenes of mounted police officers charging towards miners with their truncheons raised are images that many have found impossible to forget. Today, it is widely recognised as one of the most aggressive acts of state-sanctioned violence in recent British memory. Indeed, the Orgreave Trust called it one of the most serious miscarriages of justice in this country's history. And that is why we fundamentally need a UK-wide inquiry, because there are still contested accounts of the events on that day. An inquiry would finally establish the facts and set the record straight once and for all. Because we all know, as part of the wider effort to discredit unions, the Thatcher government, aided and abetted by South Yorkshire Police, so to amplify the narrative that it was the miners and not the police who initiated the violence. But let me tell you, my dad was there. He was present at Orgreave. He saw what happened with his own eyes. He, alongside thousands of others, will attest that this narrative was untrue. He and others fled from horrific scenes of assault and brutalisation at the hands of South Yorkshire Police with genuine fear for his own safety. It is a huge act of generational injustice for this to have never been investigated by a public inquiry. The prosecutions against the 95 arrested protesters all collapsed precisely because their trials exposed the flimsy testimonies and unreliable evidence from police officers, some of which were later found to be prejudiced. Serious allegations have emerged about the extent to which South Yorkshire Police acted to cover up their wrongdoing, from the submission of misleading evidence to junior officers having their testimonies dictated to them by their superiors. What happened at Orgreave and in the years that followed was a serious failure of policing. Only a full public inquiry can right this fundamental wrong. And indeed, much of the groundwork, as we have heard, for an inquiry has already been done. Colleagues will be aware that in June 2015, the then Home Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, commendably opened the door to a public inquiry by inviting submissions for why an inquiry is needed. But the following year, her successor stood up in the chamber and ruled out an inquiry of any kind. That was in 2016. That is 6 years ago, and so much has changed since then. The 2019 election saw a wave of new members elected to this place, myself included, but many of these were new Conservative members who now represent large ex-mining communities. And to these colleagues, if they were here, bothered to represent their constituencies, I would say this: call on your friends in government to hold this inquiry. Many of their constituents will have been at Orgreave that day. Many of their constituents will know firsthand that the popular narrative in the media about Orgreave was utterly false. And in October 2020, the Scottish Parliament, as we have heard, accepted the findings of the Scottish Review into policing during the strike. And their Conservative colleagues in the Scottish Parliament supported it and its outcome. The precedent, the groundwork and the cross-party support for an inquiry is all there. We just need the Tory government here in Westminster to listen. If they're serious about retaining these red wall seats, which I hope they're not, and they won't be, they'd be wise to pay attention. But this is bigger than politics, Ms McVeigh. Fundamentally, an inquiry is one of the many steps that we urgently need to take to restore public trust in policing. Because public trust in policing is vital. I know from my own constituency in Pontypridd and Taffili that when police play a positive, integrated role in our communities, everyone benefits. Indeed, my own brother is now a police officer, so that just goes to show that it comes full circle. But the events of Orgreave serve to seriously undermine public trust in the police. In the case of South Yorkshire Police, undermined even further by the Hillsborough disaster just a few years later, of which we now know the police negligence was instrumental. Failures at Hillsborough and at Orgreave have been widely connected and understood to be part of the systemic culture that was at the heart of South Yorkshire Police. Just as the Hillsborough inquest brought vindication and comfort to the families of the 97 victims found to have been unlawfully killed, an inquiry into Orgreave would bring clarity and accountability and justice, finally justice. Trust in the police, particularly the Metropolitan Police, has eroded further in recent years in the wake of revelations about systemic racism and misogyny in the force. I will never forget the image of the Metropolitan Police officers pinning women to the ground at a peaceful protest, vigil. It wasn't a protest, it was a vigil, to commemorate the horrific murder of Sarah Everard at the hands of a Metropolitan Police officer. Just as these women were brutalised for daring to hold a commemorative vigil, protesters at Orgreave were assaulted and brutalised for daring to come together to fight for their rights. As colleagues will be aware, only yesterday the Met Police was placed under special measures by the police watchdog for serious and critical shortcomings. If action is to be taken to address failures at the Met, it is only right that action is taken to address historic failures that led to the Battle of Orgreave. Ultimately, we must not allow the rot of eroded public trust to fester any longer. If the government is committed to rebuilding public trust, as it says it is, then they know what they can do. Let's hold an inquiry now, without any further delay, and provide justice to these families who greatly deserve it.
Ian Lavery.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and can I congratulate the Honourable Member for Midlothian for bringing this extremely important debate to Westminster Hall. At this moment in time, I've got to declare an interest. I was one of those 11,000 miners that were arrested during the strike. I make no apologies for that. I think I'm probably the only Member of Parliament sitting at this moment in time that was part of the miners' strike and on strike for the full year, which again, I'm extremely proud of. You know, during that time, it was extremely difficult times. It was a difficult year because we've seen the miners generally are very hard-working, conscientious people. Very few miners have ever been in trouble with the police before in communities up and down the UK. Hard-working, hard-playing individuals who worked very hard and was a backbone of this nation. And what I experienced as a very young lad was, I'll never ever forget it. My honourable friend, the member for Pontypridd, said it shaped her character. It definitely shaped mine. For better or for worse, some might say it's for worse. Some might say it's for better. I think it was for my father, my brothers, my family, my community were all out on strike to save the British coal mining industry. And what we experienced was an absolute disgrace. And I think there's an appetite, Ms McVeigh, there's an appetite for a public inquiry into what went on. Whether we want to talk about the actions of the police, which has been already well documented by the previous two speakers, whether we want to talk about the actions of the courts, of the magistrates, of the Crown Courts, the way in which miners suffered abuse, really, from the legal system in terms of plea bargaining. Accept this and you'll not go to prison. Accept this charge and you'll not get a longer sentence, when indeed many of these people hadn't committed anything at all. They deserve justice, Ms McVeigh. They really do deserve justice, because these were hard-working, honest individuals, and as has already been explained, basically attacked by the police state, as it were, at the time. I could recite a whole number of occurrences where I was personally involved in. I'll not bore people to death with that, but they were really significant. I was never involved in anything with the police all my life till the miners' strike. And then, after the miners' strike, I've never been involved with the police since. And I'm very, very proud of the fact that that's my record. My record with the police is industrial, and it was to save communities. Whether we want to talk about a whole number of things, about whether the police infiltration in the strike, whether we actually had armed forces in the strike, whether we want to talk about the way in which an individual might have been picked off the picket line for no reason whatsoever and actually lost their job, lost their pensions, were blacklisted, never to get a job again. Some of them even ended up in prison. And I think there needs to be an inquiry to sort this out. Who was actually pulling the strings? Who was pulling the strings at the time? And recent documents show that it was the Thatcher cabinet, if not Margaret Thatcher herself, that made a series of interventions in the miners. We want to know what happened, Ms McVeigh. We need to understand. We need to try and draw a line under what actually happened, which smashed our communities to smithereens. Now, the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign have done a marvellous campaign over many years trying to seek an inquiry into what happened at Orgreave. All well and good and well deserved, and congratulations to every one of them and their tenacity. But the reality is, it was mining communities in South Wales, in Scotland, in the North East, in Northumberland, in Durham, in Yorkshire. We all suffered as a consequence of the miners' strike through some form of intervention from the police. And I think that it's more than Orgreave, but Orgreave was just the worst of the worst of the worst. You know, we'll look back at that. I mean, it's nearly 40 years. We can look back at that and think, did that really happen in this country? You know, the BBC, like, reversing the coverage so it wasn't the miners. They said it was the miners attacking the police. There was the BBC reversed the coverage so it was the miners attacking the police. How bizarre in the UK that be allowed to happen. I'm absolutely delighted that the Scottish Parliament have decided to pardon the miners in the Scottish area. I think the point of compensation is something which we need discuss and debate, as already has been highlighted. But there is an overwhelming appetite for a public inquiry. I think if it can be done in Scotland with regard to pardons, perhaps the Minister can explain why, if it can be done in Scotland and why it has been done in Scotland unanimously in the Scottish Parliament, why can it not be achieved for the rest of the UK? So I'm just simply saying, in winding my contribution back, I could speak for hours on this, Ms McVeigh. I just think the miners deserve to be able to draw a line under it. Many miners have went to the grave with criminal charges for fighting for the communities, picked off a picket line by police from 300 miles away in order to serve a cause which we were terribly, terribly opposed to. So I would ask the Minister to not just simply discount the idea of potentially having an inquiry into not just the policing but the miners' strike in its entirety. And just take a lesson from the Shrewsbury 24 campaign. Shrewsbury 24 campaign took part in, it happened in the 1970s, a strike of building workers. They fought and fought and fought and fought and fought for justice, and they've only just getting recognised last year through papers which had to be disclosed to the public from the government that there were of all the wrongdoings of the police. We'll keep campaigning for this, Ms McVeigh, because the miners, the families and the communities, even though 40 years ago, still are very raw about this. Thank you.
Stephanie Peacock.
Under your chairship, Ms McVeigh, and to follow my honourable friend. And I'd like to begin by congratulating the member for Midlothian for securing this incredibly important debate. Before the forced closure of the pits, mining once helped sustain 30,000 jobs in my constituency of Barnsley East and formed the heart of many working-class communities across the coalfields. In dirty and dangerous conditions, miners risk their lives and their health to keep our lights on. Striking is always a last resort, but faced with the politically motivated destruction of their livelihoods and being branded the enemy within by the Tory government, many in Barnsley and beyond were forced to last a year without income in order to stand up for their jobs. And I would like to focus my comments on Orgreave. And at Orgreave, where in keeping with the narrative that the miners were the enemy rather than simply defending their jobs, footage of this event is widely understood to have been reversed, portraying miners as having provoked the violence rather than having responded to police aggression. Indeed, though 95 miners were arrested at the time, all those who were charged were later acquitted as police evidence was discredited. Since then, evidence of police intent to orchestrate the violence and pervert the course of justice afterwards by manufacturing statements has mounted. But despite this, there has been a distinct refusal to investigate what really occurred. When South Yorkshire Police handed itself over to the IPCC after new evidence emerged, they took 2 long years to decide that allegations of assault and misconduct could not be pursued. Following this, and I'd like to place on record my thanks for the work of the member for Sheffield Heeley, who secured and chaired a meeting with the Home Secretary, calling for an inquiry into Orgreave. The Honourable Member for Maidenhead subsequently invited submissions for why an inquiry was needed, going on to express the importance of restoring public trust in our police, saying, "We must never underestimate how the poison of decades-old misdeeds seeps down the years." However, shortly after, her successor as Home Secretary decided that there would be very few lessons learned from the events at Orgreaves and that there were no deaths or wrongful convictions and therefore an inquiry was not needed. This decision later revealed to be politically motivated out of a will not to slur the memory of Thatcher. But people do not have to die for a deep injustice to have occurred. Those who suffered at the hands of police violence, those who were wrongfully arrested, and those whose reputation was publicly and politically tarnished still matter. And it matters to all of us too, because if we are to have trust in our institutions, we have to believe that wrongdoing and malpractice will be investigated and addressed. Recent inquiries, such as the uncovering of the role of spy cops, the Hillsborough Review and the Scottish Review into policing during the miners' strike, have all demonstrated this, with vital lessons being learned and those impacted given a chance to be vindicated by the truth. So I'd like to ask the Minister what action the Department will take to bring to light all available evidence, including the full IPCC scoping report and the Association of Chief Police Officers files relating to Orgreave that are embargoed to 2066. And will they consider all this new evidence in an inquiry where all those with an interest and experience are invited to participate? I'd like to pay tribute to all those who have campaigned on this issue, including my many colleagues, the NUM and the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign. I first called for justice for those at Orgreave in my maiden speech 5 years ago. Since then, many miners have sadly passed away. We can't wait any longer. The government should grant an inquiry now.
Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship for the second time today. I'd also like to thank the Honourable Member for Midlothian for bringing this debate. It comes after the miners' strike pardons bill, as you mentioned, in Scotland, as was mentioned in Scotland. Finally, Scottish miners who are wrongly convicted for defending their livelihoods during the strike will have some form of justice. Justice delayed is better than justice denied, but we should all be clear that the damage and the delay that this has caused has been huge. I understand that as a Sheffield MP, with a constituency only a few miles over from the site of the Orgreave coking plant, just how deep this runs. I've heard directly from miners and their families about the ordeal they were put through during the strike. That's why I'm proud to join the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign in their annual rally every 18th of June to call on the justice for the 95 miners who were wrongly faced charges for what happened at Orgreave. With many facing potential life imprisonment, the seriousness of the claims against them is huge. The farce of their trials, the speed in which the prosecutions fell apart, and the obviously false testimony given by police is a stain on our justice system and is a stain on South Yorkshire's policing. Not only did the policing on that day inflict great physical injury to people at the picket, it also left long-term scars on individuals and communities that no one has answered for. The survivors of Orgreave deserve a full inquiry into what has happened and why. This isn't about digging up history, it's about understanding what role the police played on that day and why, who was involved in making decisions, and how far to the heart of government did those decisions go. Those aren't just important questions for the miners who suffered directly, they are a concern of every single citizen in this country. Because there is an unbroken line between the police violence at Orgreave to the cost of living crisis today, laying the foundations for the low-pay, zero-hours economy we're currently living through, meant defeating and demoralising the trade union movement. The idea that the police were used to that end should chill the bones of everyone in this room. We're already seeing the chilling effect of the anti-protest legislation on street protests. The prosecution of the Scottish miners and those at Orgreave raises questions about the relationship between politics, policing and the justice system. Those questions will be increasingly relevant as we head into what looks like a summer of industrial action, with people rightly seeking to defend their pay and conditions while profits soar. So the need for an inquiry is pressing. It must have the power to require all the relevant information and evidence is produced and presented to it. Everyone with an interest must be able to fully participate and get their voices heard. The panel should be independent, objective and have the skills to understand all the issues at stake, and it should be transparent, open and not overly long. After the Scottish Pardons Bill, that is the next step in righting the historic wrong that was done to communities up and down the country during the strike.
We move now to the front bench. Once the Minister has spoken, we'll go back to Owen Thompson, who'll do the wind-up. So we go to the SNP spokesperson, Chris Stevens.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And can I congratulate my good friend and comrade, the Honourable Member for Midlothian, for securing this debate. He will recall, I'm not just saying that because he's the chief whip of our group, I'm saying that because he will know that he and I regularly found ourselves in front page of some of the more right-wing newspapers in Scotland actually condemning us for having the temerity to ask for a miners' inquiry in Scotland. So that the Honourable Member for Midlothian has, for many years, along with a number of others, asked for a Scottish inquiry. And I think it would be only right and fair to praise the efforts of a friend of mine, former member of the Scottish Parliament, Neil Findlay, who was one of the lead campaigners in ensuring that there was a miners' inquiry in Scotland. And I do think that Neil is sadly missed in the Scottish Parliament, but I know that he's continuing to do great work with trade unions in Scotland. So, as other members have said, and I do want to congratulate all the members who've spoken, and I do want to say to another friend, the Honourable Member for Wansbeck, he has nothing to apologise for. Nothing to apologise for at all, and I think that perhaps the events has probably made him for the better, and it's certainly made him a very good Member of Parliament. So the Scottish Minors Pardon Bill is an important and historic step towards trying to aid reconciliation. It's going to start helping to heal some of the wounds within Scotland's mining communities. Groundbreaking legislation, Ms McVeigh, that will restore dignity to those convicted, provide comfort to their families, and I would hope bring the start of some closure to the sense of injustice members of mining communities may continue to feel. We very much sympathise with miners who lost out on redundancy payments and pension rights as a result of being sacked by the National Coal Board after being arrested or convicted for actions while participating in the strike. And I think that I hope that it would put to some of the demonisation, and we even saw some of that last week, Ms McVeigh, of trade unions who take industrial action on behalf of their members. Perhaps that the demonisation that we saw in the miners' strike is very much evident in the last week towards the rail workers. I take the view that those who take industrial action are exercising their human rights, and they have a human right to withdraw their labour against any employer. As Professor Jim Murdoch of the School of Law at Glasgow University, who works with Mr Scott QC in the Independent Review, said, as members of the Independent Review, our task was primarily to listen, to show that those affected by the miners' strike had a voice more than a third of a century later. At each of these meetings we held, it was clear that the pain felt by former miners and their families was still raw. The response to the miners' strike at the time left a deep scar in too many communities. The stories showed without doubt that the criminal justice system all too often reacted in an arbitrary and disproportionate manner. Our task was to seek to promote a sense of reconciliation, and we are pleased that our report and its recommendation has received clear support today in the Scottish Parliament. So the Miners' Strike Pardons Scotland Bill pardons the offences of breach of the peace, obstructing a police officer, breach of bail and theft, which occurred during the 1984 to 85 disputes. And the new legislation will hopefully has been welcomed by the National Union of Mine Workers in Scotland. And that brings us now to having the Scottish context why there should be why the UK government should now launch a UK-wide inquiry. I think the Cabinet Secretary for Justice in Scotland, Keith Brown, puts it rather well when he says, it is now right that the government recognises the passing of this historic legislation and gives further consideration to a UK-wide public inquiry and the payment of compensation to former miners. He then says that he has written to the Home Secretary urging her to reconsider her position, giving the strong support for this landmark bill. And perhaps the Minister could tell us if the Home Secretary has indeed received that letter and when the Scottish Government will receive a response. Now, as other members have said, Ms McVeigh, many of us who support the inquiry were surprised when the then Home Secretary Amber Rudd announced in October 2016 that the UK Government was ruling out an inquiry into the events at Orgreave in South Yorkshire, and probably referred to as one of the most notorious flashpoints in the miners' strike. And I too have received an excellent briefing from the Orgreave Justice and Truth campaign, and I think they are correct to ask the UK Government to reconsider because of new evidence that's transpired since October 2016, the disclosure of documents that exist that are being embargoed until 2066. I don't think we should wait until then. The existence and location of documents in the South Yorkshire archives, and indeed new evidence that's coming to light as a result of the ongoing undercover police inquiry, of which the National Union of Mine Workers is a core participant. And indeed, of most concern to me, the recent Daily Mirror article, which has exposed a conversation by Amber Rudd about the reasons not to hold an Orgreave inquiry because it would slur the memory of Thatcher and upset party members. Well, protecting someone's legacy, Ms McVeigh, I would suggest is not a reason not to have this inquiry. And I think that certainly raises alarm bells with me, as I'm sure it does with other members of this House. I'll give way to my good friend.
Thanks very much for giving way. Can I just say that I totally agree with you with regard to Neil Findlay. What a tremendous campaign he's run. But would you like to, would my honourable friend like to comment on the fact that during the miners' strike, Scotland represented 10% of the workforce in the National Coal Board, but 30% of those who were arrested following their arrest, were sacked. That was terribly unequal right away through the country. Would you like to comment on why perhaps that might have been?
Well, I think it's it's actually the independent review makes it very clear. It was because of the disproportionate actions of the police at that point and the justice system. And I too was alarmed at the figures when they were brought to my attention. So my honourable friend is absolutely right. And he will also be aware, I'm sure, of the Labour Party report that was prepared by Gordon Brown and Merlin Rees, a future Prime Minister and a former Home Secretary, which also raised and highlighted the concerns then in 1985 about the strike and recommended there should be a Royal Commission into the whole circumstances leading up to the strike as well as the conduct of the strike, but also looking at the wider constitutional aspects of the development of policing, including accountability. So the demands even then in 1985 talk about some of the issues which my honourable friend has raised. Ms McVeigh, I hope that the Minister will respond positively. I do think that he should take very serious note of what not just myself but other honourable members have said about some of the vilification of trade union activity that's going on presently. Because that vilification we saw during the miners' strike in 84 to 85, and we're seeing some of it today, and perhaps he could encourage some of his colleagues to engage in perhaps a better discourse when discussing these issues. Thank you.
Alex Cunningham.
Thank you very much, Mrs McVeigh. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon, and sorry for the dodgy voice. If you excuse me occasionally, I will have to drink. I too would like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Midlothian for securing this debate. He spoke very powerfully to the experience of miners and their communities through the strikes and how the Scottish Review has helped to begin healing some decades-old wounds. He referred to Bowling Green bevies between police and miners. Sadly, they are no more, and I don't think that's a legacy. Any of them would have wanted that. I'd also like to pay tribute to the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign and all those who have campaigned to shine a light on the policing of the 1984-85 strike. And my honourable friend, the member for Pontypridd, she spoke of the police charges there, but she spoke of her pride in her dad. And it's lovely to hear people talk about their pride in the dad. Mine's nearly 90, well, he's 90 now, he's nearly 91, and his dad worked in the mines. So I also have that legacy, and it helped shape me as well. Now, Labour has long supported calls for a full and independent public inquiry into this matter, and particularly into the events at the Orgreave coking plant on the 18th of June. And my honourable friend, the member for Sheffield Hallam, she spoke of the horrors of what actually happened there. Now, I myself, as I've indicated, I grew up in a mining community with a proud family heritage in the industry, so I understand the impact of the government's handling of the strikes on miners, their families and communities, an impact that endures to this day. And my honourable friend, the member for Wansbeck, he spoke of his own history very openly and very honestly, but also spoke about those hard-working individuals in the mines, criminalised during the strike, but there's continuing pride in his colleagues as well. In 2015 and most of 2016, it looked as though the government were moving in the right direction on this. Following the findings of the Independent Police Complaints Commission scoping exercise in June 2015, the then Home Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, invited submissions for why a public inquiry was needed. A meeting took place subsequently with the following Home Secretary, former member for Hastings and Rye, in September 2016, where the potential format of an inquiry or investigation was discussed. Many of us across the House were then understandably confused and deeply disappointed when only a couple of months later, in October 2016, the then Home Secretary confirmed in response to a parliamentary question that no inquiry of any kind would take place. A great sadness on that particular day. But can the Minister please confirm that it was not, and others have raised this issue, that it wasn't for the reasons raised in Sasha Swire's book, that an inquiry into Orgreave would slur the memory of Thatcher and the party won't like it? Because if that's true, it would be quite disgraceful. Yeah. That said, even the official reasons given by the former member for Hastings and Rye are extremely thin. So it's important that we address the wrongdoings of the past, not just for Orgreave, but across the whole country. Just because no one died as a result of the state's handling of the strikes does not mean there are not valuable lessons to be learned from examining them. I spoke this morning to Chris Pearce from the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign, and she reminded me that time is of the essence, as many of the miners affected have already died, and others are elderly, but still hope for a fair hearing. I will give way.
Just briefly, we've all got history on this. As a youngster, I was the deputy head of the Social Insurance Department at the NUM, managing the Mine Workers Pension Scheme. As you said, many of those miners are now elderly, they're pensioners, or their widows are there. There could be an act of goodwill by the government on this, which is to implement the recommendations of the Bayes Select Committee on the Mine Workers Pension Scheme, so that the mine workers who are now elderly and their widows can have a greater share of the pension scheme that they've actually funded throughout their lives.
As well, my right honourable friend makes the point himself. It's very clear and very concise as well that action does need to be taken, because it isn't just the miners who have died, it's their families that follow them as well. As been outlined in this debate, there are a number of developments that have occurred since 2016, such as the release of the Home Office files from 84 and 85 to the National Archives, the disclosure by the National Police Chiefs Council of the existence and location of Association of Police Chief Officers files relating to Orgreave and the miners' strike, which I understand were actually embargoed until 2066. I'll be 111 in 2066 if I live that long. And new evidence that has come to light as a result of the ongoing undercover police inquiry, others have referred to this, of which the National Union of Mine Workers is a core participant. I hope the Minister gives each of these developments full and proper consideration. Perhaps more significant is the trigger for this debate, and that is the findings of the Scottish Miners' Review. I wonder, and I'll look at the Minister, if seeing that MSP colleagues' support for the Scottish Review and its outcome will encourage him and Conservative MPs and the rest of the UK to reconsider their position. I certainly hope it will. The Government has, over the last 6 years, however, continually rejected calls for an inquiry. In November of 2022, no, it couldn't have been 2022, it must have been 2021, the then Policing Minister said that such an inquiry is not in the wider public interest or required for any other reasons. These benches completely disagree. We believe that it is only by properly investigating those events that we can secure the justice that has long evaded all those affected. In the words of the former Conservative Home Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, in her speech to the Police Federation annual conference in 2016, we must all understand, she said, the need to face up to the past and right the wrongs that continue to jeopardise the work of police officers today, because historical inquiries are not archaeological excavations. They are not purely exercises in truth and reconciliation. They are about ensuring justice is done. We must never underestimate how the poison of decades-old misdeeds seeps down through the years and is just as toxic today as it was then. That's why difficult truths, however unpalatable they may be, must be confronted head-on. No matter how long it takes, justice must be done and be seen to be done. The Labour Party does not turn a blind eye and shrug off historic injustices. And from the quote I have just read from the former Home Secretary and former Prime Minister, we can see there was once a time that the Conservative Party didn't either. But instead of heeding the lessons of historic heavy policing, the Home Office is presiding over draconian changes in protest legislation, some of which came into force just yesterday, and expanding police powers for protests disproportionately through the Public Order Bill. The deplorable action of this Home Office show more than ever why learning the lessons of the past through inquiries such as this is the necessary work of good government. I hope the Minister will now do the right thing and order the inquiry without further delay.
Minister.
Ms McVeigh, a great pleasure to appear before you. We've both come a long way since we were teenagers together in South Liverpool. I'm grateful to the Honourable Member from Midlothian for securing this debate, and I know he's had a long-standing interest in these issues. Obviously, I've listened carefully to all the contributions, and I should open by saying that I do, of course, recognise the significance of the miners' strike, its impact on mining communities throughout the United Kingdom and indeed the whole country, including those who were affected by what occurred at the Orgreave coking plant on the 18th of June 1984. I remember the footage well. I was a teenager at the time and a student shortly thereafter in the northeast, and I know that the events of that period continue to resonate in those communities. Now, obviously the House is calling for a wide inquiry into the policing of the strikes, and successive Home Secretaries have given careful consideration to the issues arising from those calls for this inquiry into the policing of the strikes at Orgreave and, by extension, the miners' strikes more broadly. As members will know and have mentioned, the former Home Secretary Amber Rudd announced the decision in October 2016 not to undertake an inquiry, and her successor, my right honourable friend, the member for Bromsgrove, upheld that decision in September 2018. In a spirit of transparency, in 2017, the Home Office released the files which were held by the Department to the National Archives, and they are available there for public review. We have urged other departments to do the same, and South Yorkshire Police are in the process of reviewing their files to also release them. The core argument given, though, by the Home Secretaries was that given the passage of time and the large number of legislative and systemic changes since 1984, an inquiry is unlikely to result in relevant lessons for today's system. The Government stands by that decision. Crucially, there have been very significant changes to policing since then, including major reforms to criminal procedure, changes to public order policing and practice, stronger external scrutiny, and greater local accountability. Specifically, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act in 1984, which came into force from January 1985, and other legislative and operational changes made since then have vastly improved the way police investigations and powers operate. The exemplary standards of behaviour expected of everyone who works in policing were reinforced by the introduction of a statutory code of ethics, which was laid before this House in 2014 and which is currently being reviewed. The introduction of further provisions through the Policing and Crime Act 2017 has increased the powers of the Independent Office for Police Conduct, clarified its investigative processes, and further safeguarded its independence. These reforms were introduced in 2018 and 2020, alongside wider reforms to the police discipline and complaint system. The legislative reforms in 2020 to overhaul the police complaints and disciplinary systems were wide-ranging, designed to simplify processes while increasing transparency and independence. Further, the creation of the Crown Prosecution Service in 1986, with the introduction of the independent CPS prosecutors, fundamentally altered the prosecution of offences and ended the existence of ad hoc prosecution arrangements across the country. Given the landscape has changed so markedly, it is difficult to see how a review of the events and practices of more than 3 decades ago would yield significant lessons for the policing system today. In the light of the significant changes since the strikes, there are no plans to undertake an assessment of the potential merits of establishing an independent inquiry into the policing of the miners' strikes in 1984 to 85 in England and Wales. Neither does the Government plan to review the decision not to establish a public inquiry into the events at the Orgreave coking plant on the 18th of June 1984. For the Government's part, we are completely focused on making sure that policing is the best it can be, including through reforms to improve accountability and transparency. Public confidence is pivotal to our model of policing by consent.
Christine.
Yeah, I thank the Minister for giving way. He's given his reasons not to have an inquiry, but obviously in Scotland there was an independent review and pardons have been issued for certain offences. Is that something that the UK Government is considering?
Chairman, we're not currently considering that particular route of action. We have received the letter that the Honourable Gentleman referred to. Indeed, we've received a number of letters over the last couple of years on this matter to which we responded. I know my Right Honourable friend, the Home Secretary, is considering that letter and will respond in due course. So, Madam Chairman, I would like to thank everybody for participating in the debate. I have obviously listened very carefully to the points that is raised. I'm grateful for the opportunity to underline how far UK policing has come since the miners' strike. Progress has undoubtedly been made, but that is not to say in any way we're complacent. On the contrary, we're constantly challenging the police to get better in all they do. We have overseen significant reform. We continue in driving improvements that benefit policing and the people they serve. Thank you.
Owen Thompson to wind up.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh. I thank all honourable members for the contributions this afternoon. I think we've heard a very wide-ranging range of views from communities across mainland UK and the countries of it, and each of them effectively saying very similar things, that our communities all bore the brunt of the effect of the miners' strike, and despite that, the government still aren't listening, I'm afraid, quite frankly. I thank the Minister for his response, but I'm very disappointed in it. The release of files just isn't good enough. It doesn't cut it. And time simply can't be used as an excuse for not doing the right thing. It just isn't good enough. Regardless of whatever changes have taken place in the years in the interim in policing, it doesn't change the need for an inquiry. So I would simply ask the Minister, despite the answer to the debate today, if he would genuinely consider all of the range of comments that have been made today, and I think this is something that isn't going to go away. I'm certainly not going to stop asking these questions, so that the government do take a real good look at this and seriously consider that there is still absolutely a need for an inquiry.
Question is that this House has considered the potential merits of a UK-wide inquiry into the miners' strike of 1984 to 85. As many of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order,